Frank "Chicky" Narducci was in a bad spot. While it appeared that the multi-millionaire mob capo had survived the bloodletting in the aftermath of the Bruno and Testa killings, Narducci faced an adversary with greater might than little Nicky Scarfo, Rico. Narducci was one of several defendants named in a 1980 racketeering indictment brought by the U.S. Attorney's Office in Philadelphia, aimed at dismantling the Bruno crime family. The racketeering-influenced corrupt organization, RICO statute, had become the federal government's most reliable weapon in the war against organized crime. Within the scope of a RICO prosecution, the government first had to prove that the defendants were members of an organization and that the organization had engaged in illegal activities. The government then had to show that each defendant had participated in at least 2 predicate crimes on behalf of the organization. Predicate crimes covered under the broad RICO statute included facilitating illegal gambling operations, loaning money at usurious rates, the trafficking of narcotics, extortion, and acts of violence, including murder. In theory, a low-level mob bookmaker, who was also a loan shark, could find himself facing more serious charges if other members of the organization had committed a murder on behalf of the organization. The RICO indictment that charged Narducci originally included Angelo Bruno and Philip Testa, but both men had died before the case was brought to court. Jury selection began on January 4, 1982, inside the federal courthouse, located on Market Street, a few blocks away from Philadelphia's Old City neighborhood, which is one of the most historic areas in the United States. Home to the Liberty Bell and the world-famous Betsy Ross House, Old City is where the Declaration of Independence was first read, and the Constitution of the United States was written. In all likelihood, none of this was on Chicky Narducci's mind as he and several co-defendants left the courthouse after an exhausting 4th day of jury selection. The kind of justice that Narducci was to face was not what our nation's forefathers had in mind. That evening, as Narducci parked his late-model Cadillac half a block away from his South Philadelphia home and exited the car, he heard someone say, "Hey, Frank!" and he turned around to see who was calling. It was the Grim Reaper. To Narducci's shock and horror, he was staring at Salvi Testa with a gun in his hand. The mob's longtime gambling czar's luck was about to run out. Testa pumped the first several shots into Narducci's face from point-blank range, and Narducci's body crumbled into the street below him. Testa and another gunman, his best friend and right-hand man, Joseph "Joe Punge" Pungatore, would then empty their guns into Narducci's fallen body as he lay bleeding and helpless, wedged between his car and the curb, stuck in the gutter. When it was over, Narducci was dead, having been shot 10 times in the face, head, neck, and chest. Salvi was on cloud 9 after he killed Narducci. That's how much he hated him for what he had done to his father. He would brag about it and say, "I made sure he knew it was me, and I gave him a second so he knew what was coming. You should have seen the look on his face when he knew I had him." The revenge killing of Chicky Narducci could be justified by Narducci's involvement in the bombing death of Philip Testa. But Scarfo's next killing seemed to be rooted in only pure evil and vindictiveness. My uncle hated this guy from South Philly named Mickey Diamond. Hated him with a passion. This went back 15-20 years. Mickey Diamond was close with Joseph, Joe the Boss Runeta, who was Ange's consigliere before Caponegro, and Joe the Boss hated my uncle because my uncle once made a disparaging remark about his daughter. My uncle said she was ugly, and Joe the Boss went nuts and wanted Ange to have my uncle killed, but Ange said no. This was in the late 60s, for Christ's sake, but ever since then my uncle hated both Joe the Boss and Mickey Diamond. Now, adding to this, around the same time frame, Chucky Merlino had gotten into trouble with 2 old-time mob guys. Mickey Diamond had ratted Chucky out to the old-timers, and they demanded a sit-down with Ange over what happened with Chucky, and because Joe the Boss was the consigliere, it was his job to mediate the dispute. Now, at the time, Chucky wasn't a made guy, but my uncle was, and my uncle and Chucky were best friends. So my uncle goes to the sit-down and represents Chucky. He goes to bat for him. This Joe the boss hated my uncle so much, his recommendation to Ange was that Chucky should be killed. He wanted to kill Chucky because Ange wouldn't let him kill my uncle. My uncle challenged him at the sit-down, and this made Joe the boss hate my uncle even more. These old-timers were all about respect. So Ange tells Joe the boss. He says, "We're not killing the kid, not for this," meaning Chucky. And Chucky apologizes to the old-timers, and the whole thing is forgotten. But the venom between my uncle and Joe the boss continued until he died. I think he died in 1977. When Joe the boss died, that's when Caponegro became the consigliere, and Mickey Diamond kind of went with Caponegro. Once Caponegro got killed, Mickey Diamond was basically out of it. He wasn't really in play. So maybe a week or so after we killed Chicky Narducci, my uncle and I head to the Brajole Cafe for a meeting. I thought it was going to be just us and Chucky, but when we get there, it's Chucky and Frank Monty. A few minutes later, in comes the old-timers who had the beef with Chucky all those years before. Now, all these years later, Chucky is the underboss, and these guys are semi-retired. I'm thinking to myself, why is my uncle meeting with these two guys? My uncle says to them, "Fellas, I need your help with something." Now, if I don't know why they're there, I know that they have absolutely no idea why they're there. So they say, "Sure, Nick, what do you need?" And my uncle says, "It's about your friend Mickey Diamond." And he makes the sign of the gun and points it to the floor. "He's gotta go." You should have seen the look on their faces. They looked like they were gonna cry. Chucky even made a face at me like he couldn't believe my uncle wanted to kill Mickey Diamond after all these years, and he was gonna make these two guys do it. Now, these guys know the rules. They know if they don't kill Mickey Diamond, my uncle's gonna kill them. But that was how my uncle was. He never forgot nothing, and he never forgave no one. On February 25th, 1982, Philadelphia police found the body of Dominic "Mickey Diamond" DeVito in the trunk of his car, parked in a residential neighborhood in South Philadelphia. DeVito had been shot in the head with a .38, and his body had been placed in plastic trash bags. His hands and feet had been tied behind him. The DeVito killing was the 16th Philly mob killing in 6 years, and number 17 was less than 3 weeks away. Around this time, there was a message on a local TV channel in Atlantic City that played over and over for almost 3 days that said, "Nicky and Phil, you're next." It was handwritten on a piece of paper and was mixed in with some local advertisements. When we saw it, my uncle said, "What the fuck is this?" I later found out that an Atlantic City cop who lived to break balls was the one who wrote it, and him and his friend, another cop who loved to break balls, put it in the projector inside of Convention Hall as a joke. There was nothing funny about what would happen next. Salvi Testa had started 1982 off by killing Chicky Narducci, one of the men responsible for the bombing death of his father on March 15, 1981. The other killer, Rocco Marinucci, thought that Scarfo and Testa were unaware of his involvement in the Philip Testa murder. That's because guys in Salvi Testa's crew had been referring burglary jobs to Marinucci, who, in addition to making pizzas and nail bombs, was also a renowned burglar. Right after Salvi killed Chicky Narducci, he went and grabbed Chicky's 2 sons, Frankie and Philip, and brought them in. He told them, "I killed your father because he killed my father." Now, Frankie and Philip were around La Cosa Nostra all of their life through their father, so they knew the rules. Frankie was a made guy, and he was part of Salvi's crew. Now, when Salvi tells them this, they knew there is nothing they can say or do about it. If they tried to retaliate or anything like that, we would have killed them both, and they knew it, so they accepted it for what it was, and everyone moved on. Now, at the time, Frankie Narducci was tight with this Rocco Marinucci, the kid who made the bomb. So Salvi's crew, which included both Narducci brothers, are feeding this Rocco little jobs, and Rocco and Salvi's guys are making money together, and Rocco thinks he's in the clear. But this is the trap. It's just like we did with the concrete union job for Vincent Falcone, and just like Vince, Rocco falls for it. Salvi's guys tell Rocco, "We need you to help us open a safe. We think there's a couple million in there." So Rocco and Salvi's guys go to the Buckeye Club in South Philadelphia, which is Frankie Narducci's place, to go over the plan to get the safe and get the tools they needed. Rocco is thinking, this is it. This is the score of a lifetime. Now this whole time, Rocco is dealing with guys in Salvi's crew, but never Salvi himself. So they get to the club, they go inside, and the lights are out. Frankie says, "Must be a bad bulb." The other guys come in, and Rocco is asking them if they brought flashlights so they can see, because the place is pitch black. Frankie says to Rocco, "There's some flashlights in the back room, and there's a light switch back there. See if that's working." Rocco finds a string hanging from the ceiling, and he pulls it, and a dim light goes on. And as Rocco turns around, instead of seeing the flashlights, he sees Salvi Testa. The Grim Reaper would strike again. Testa and his crew, who were known in law enforcement circles as the Young Executioners, lived up to their name by tying up Marinucci and brutally torturing him for several hours before putting him out of his misery. But things didn't go quite as Salvi had planned. Salvi told me afterwards that he bought a bag of M80s and cherry bombs, like the firecrackers you see on the 4th of July. He wanted to torture this kid within an inch of his life, and then, when he was ready to kill him, he wanted to put the fireworks in his mouth and keep setting them off until he died. But the problem was the saliva in his mouth made it difficult to light the firecrackers, so they kept beating him every time they wouldn't light. So finally Salvi pulls out a gun and empties it into this kid's head. Then they stuffed 3 of the firecrackers into his mouth to send a message that the killing was payback for what happened to Salvi's dad. The firecrackers weren't the only message that Salvi Testa and his Young Executioners crew would send. They purposely committed the murder on March 15, 1982, the 1-year anniversary of Philip Testa's death. In less than a year, Nicodemo, Little Nicky Scarfo, had established his burgeoning organization as the most ruthless regime in the history of the Philadelphia mob. Gone were the docile Don days of Angelo Bruno. Nicky Scarfo was a gangster, and the men around him were stone-cold killers. This is exactly what my uncle wanted. He wanted people to be afraid of us, and they were. Everyone was scared to death. And for good reason. Scarfo and Leonetti had turned Atlantic City into the Wild West of the 1970s, with several high-profile gangland killings, and now they were doing the same in the streets of South Philadelphia. As far as appearances go, Harry the Hunchback Ricobene could not have been less intimidating. Barely 5 feet tall, with a squeaky voice, a long, bushy white beard, and as you might expect from his nickname, walking with a slump due to a curvature of the spine he had had since birth, Ricobene didn't look like much to contend with. He was. Born in Sicily on July 27, 1909, Harry Ricobene came to the United States with his family as a young boy, settling in South Philadelphia and quickly gravitating to a life of crime. Law enforcement records indicate he was inducted into the mob by Prohibition-era Don Salvatore Sabella when he was only 17 years old. Benefiting from the early experience of plying his trade in the underworld, he became an expert and well-respected racketeer by the time he reached his 30s, making money from a variety of illicit endeavors and keeping himself continually in the good graces of whoever was running the show in the Philly mob by always giving them a little taste of his action. That was until Nicky Scarfo took over. Scarfo wasn't satisfied with prior arrangements. He wanted more than a little taste of the Hunchback's vast riches. When he became boss in the spring of 1981, Little Nicky made it known to Ricobene, a one-time underworld ally, that he expected a non-negotiable set percentage of his monthly cash intake to be collected as part of SCARFO's aggressive underworld street tax. Despite the killings of John Calabrese and Stevie Burris, and the violent beating of Frankie Flowers D'Alfonso, all of whom had balked at paying SCARFO's street tax, Rico Bene, the seasoned old-school mob vet, scoffed at SCARFO's demand. Over the years, Rico Bene had built up a strong power base. He surrounded himself with a loyal and well-stocked crew of thugs, thieves, and fellow racketeers who answered to him and to him only. He, in essence, oversaw a family within a family. This fact made him believe he could challenge SCARFO in a street war, and that's exactly what he did. We started having problems with the Rico Benes in 1982. Harry refused to pay the street tax, and he was thumbing his nose at my uncle. This drove my uncle crazy. He used to say, "This guy thinks he's going to make a jerk-off out of me? We'll see about that." We tried everything to bring him in and get him on board, but Harry was a stubborn old-time Siggy, and he made it clear that he didn't acknowledge my uncle as his boss, and he wasn't going to pay us. He left us no choice. We had to kill him. SCARFO decided to send his consigliere, Frank Monte, and the treacherous Raymond Long John Martirano to see Harry's younger brother, Mario, Sonny Rico Bene, with an order from SCARFO that Sonny help in setting up his brother to be killed. The move backfired. Instead of joining the assault against his brother, Sonny Rico Bene went to his brother and warned him of the pending plot to kill him and who was involved. The hunchback's response was loud and left little doubt that he was more than willing to go toe-to-toe with little Nicky. A few weeks later, on May 13th, Frank Monte was gunned down while standing in front of his car at a South Philadelphia gas station by Joseph Padula and Victor DeLuca, two hitmen in Rico Bene's crew who had been lying in wait for the mob consigliere in a parking lot across the street from the gas station with a powerful scope-fitted rifle. The Rico Benes had struck first. Nicky SCARFO was incensed. The war was on. As if a street war with Harry Rico Bene in South Philadelphia wasn't enough, Nicky SCARFO and Philip Leonetti soon became saddled with a new problem from an old foe in Atlantic City. Now, right around the time we started beefing with Harry, Frank Gerace gets word to us through Bobby Lumio that he needs to see me and my uncle. Frank Gerace was a bartender who we knew, and we made him the president of Local 54, which was the biggest union in Atlantic City, representing the hotel and restaurant workers in the casinos. At the time, they had like 15,000 people in the union, and they were strong, but we made them even stronger. Bobby Lumio was a made guy who my uncle put in a powerful position at Local 54. He was the secretary-treasurer and was on the executive board. He also lived in one of our apartments on Georgia Avenue. At the time, Bobby was dying. He had real bad cancer, and the doctors had only given him a few months to live. Bobby tells me one day, "You gotta get with Percy," meaning Frank Gerace. "He has a problem with Joe Salerno." I say to Bobby, "Joe Salerno the plumber? They got him in the witness protection program. How's he making trouble for Frank Gerace?" I'm thinking maybe his medicines got him loopy, because Joe Salerno isn't around anymore. And I don't think he planned on coming back because he knew we would have killed him. So Bobby's lying there in the bed, and he says, "You gotta get with Percy." So the next day I send for Frank Gerace, and I have him meet me down in Margate near a place that I had on Adams Avenue. When he gets there, I tell him what Bobby had told me, and he says, "It's true, Philip. Joe Salerno was going to testify against me at a hearing with the state. They are trying to get me out of Local 54 because they are saying I am with you and your uncle, and Joe Salerno is their main witness." I told Frank I would talk to my uncle, and we would figure things out. Now, this is bad. We made a lot of money from Local 54. We were getting $50, $60, sometimes $100,000 a month, all of it in cash. If Frank Gerace got bumped out, it was going to be a problem for our family. I knew my uncle was going to go nuts when he found out. Winning the Falcone murder trial wasn't enough for him. He wanted to kill Joe Salerno for testifying against us, but we couldn't get to him because he was in the witness protection program. Every time we were around the Narducci brothers, Frank and Philip, my uncle used to ask them, "You guys seen Salerno around?" Because Joe Salerno's family lived right near where the Narduccis lived. When Frank or Philip would say no, my uncle would go into a tirade about Joe Salerno, calling him a no-good rat motherfucker or calling him a cocksucking rat, and he would tell them, if that motherless fuck ever shows his face, it's this, and he'd make the sign of the gun. I don't care who he's with. He could be with the Pope, and it's this, and make the sign of the gun. So the next morning when I pick up my uncle, I tell him about my conversation with Bobby Lumio and Frank Gerace. He went berserk about Joe Salerno. He said, "This motherfucker wants to keep trying to hurt us. We're gonna hurt him. We're gonna see how he likes it, this no-good rat motherfucker." He was irate. 1, because he was going to testify against us again, and 2, because this time it could cost us a lot of money. He said, "Today when we go see Bobby, I want him to get to the bottom of this." We were on our way to Philadelphia to see Bobby Simone, who was representing my uncle on his appeal of the federal gun charge. The whole ride up we're not talking, because we never talked in the car, or even near the car, but every 10 minutes or so my uncle would say, "This motherfucker," or mutter something to himself about Joe Salerno. I'm riding next to him, and he's talking to himself like a crazy person. So we get to Bobby's office, and he tells my uncle that if he doesn't win the appeal on the gun case, that he was looking at 2 years in prison, and he'd have to do about 18 months. It was almost like my uncle didn't hear a word Bobby said. He said, "Look, Bob, I'm not worried about the gun case. If I have to do the 2 years, I'll do the 2 years. I need you to look into this thing for me." And he told him all about the thing with Joe Salerno and Frank Gerace. Bobby said, "Okay, Nick." And he started talking about the gun case again, and my uncle waved him off and said, "Bob, we need to focus on this thing with Joe Salerno. We can worry about the gun case later." Bobby told us to give him a few days to see what was going on. During this time, Bobby Lumio was in a real bad shape. He was on his deathbed. One of the last things he said was, "Tell my friend I will miss him." He was talking about my uncle. This was on his deathbed. So after Bobby dies, my uncle hears what he had said, and my uncle said, "I don't give a fuck about him. Nobody's gonna miss him." This was a guy who was with us, a made guy, who while he was dying was looking out for us by tipping us off about the thing with Joe Salerno and Frank Gerace. But now that Bobby was dead, he couldn't do anything for my uncle. That's how he thought. That's how evil of a guy he was. So about a week later, Bobby Simone comes down to see us, and we walk up to the boardwalk, and he tells us that Joe Salerno is scheduled to testify before the state, and that if things go bad, Frank Gerace is going to be removed as the president of Local 54, and that there could be an indictment for labor racketeering charges. My uncle looks at me and shakes his head and says, "These fucking rats. We gotta do something here. We can't just sit back and watch. We gotta take action." I didn't know what to say. What could I say? Joe Salerno was in the witness protection program. It's not like he was in Atlantic City or South Philadelphia, and we could kill him. We had no idea where he was. A week later, under the protection of the United States Marshal Service, Joe Salerno would testify before the New Jersey State Casino Control Commission about Local 54 and its connections to Nicky Scarfo, Philip Leonetti, and the mob. His testimony touched on his relationship with Scarfo, Leonetti, the Merlino brothers, and mob killer Nicholas "Nick the Blade" Virgilio in the late 1970s, and each of their relationships with the Union. And then went on to detail once again the night that Philip Leonetti murdered Vincent Falcone. As Salerno testified, he wore a dark hood over his head with holes cut out around his eyes, so that his identity could remain a secret. There were more than a dozen armed U.S. Marshals in and around the building where Salerno was testifying, which was located at the corner of Tennessee and the Boardwalk in Atlantic City, less than 2 miles from Scarfo's Georgia Avenue headquarters. Salerno's testimony included a story about an incident in which Nicky Scarfo lost his temper at Bobby Lumio, a high-ranking official of Local 54, after Lumio made a joke that Scarfo didn't find funny. According to Salerno's testimony, Scarfo said to Lumio, "Let me tell you something. I got you your job, and I got that other big fat jerk-off downstairs his job, and don't you ever fucking forget it." Based in large part on the testimony of Joe Salerno, Frank Geraci was disqualified from having any further association with Local 54, as were several of his top associates, which meant that Nicky Scarfo and Philip Leonetti no longer controlled the union through Geraci. So, after we get the news that Frank Geraci is out, my uncle is furious. He was so full of venom against Joe Salerno. He said, "Do you believe this motherfucker? Can you believe what he did to us? We can't let this stand." He was enraged. Nicky Scarfo was a volatile, homicidal maniac on a good day, but the climate around him in the summer months of 1982 made him an untamed beast whose penchant for blood and violence had reached an all-time high. As if the murder of his trusted aide Frank Monti and the war with Harry Ricobene weren't enough, Scarfo had just lost control of the biggest union in Atlantic City and the riches that came with it, which amounted to almost $1 million per year in tax-free cash, and the unbridled power that came from controlling a union with thousands of members. Add to that the 2-year federal prison sentence that was hanging over his head on the 1979 weapon charge, and little Nicky wasn't exactly in what you'd call a good place. Plus, his allergies were bothering him. My uncle's allergies were real bad, and when they were bothering him, forget about it. He was the most miserable human being on the planet. Everybody would stay away. That's how bad he was. Now, around this time, we had our hands full, and my uncle was unbearable, the worst I'd ever seen him. One day my uncle says to me, "Let's take a walk." And we start walking up Georgia Avenue towards the boardwalk. We were going to meet Salvi and Philip Narducci in front of Convention Hall. As we are walking, my uncle starts telling me a story about the Blade getting drunk in the casino and starting a fight and causing this big scene. I figure he's going to tell me to go to the casino and straighten it out. He says, "This fucking guy is an embarrassment, the way he conducts himself with the drinking and all this nonsense. I've had it up to here with him, and I am done with his shenanigans. I want you to take him for a walk down the alleys behind the house, and I want you to kill him right there in the alley. Leave him in the gutter where he belongs with all his drinking." I'm thinking to myself, Jesus Christ, with everything we got going on, now we're going to start killing our own guys? What are we doing? After flippantly ordering the murder of Nicholas "Nick the Blade" Virgilio, one of his oldest friends, Nicky Scarfo was about to cross an even more sinister line with his next murder plot. So now we're on the boardwalk, and Salvi and Philip were there waiting for us. Like clockwork, my uncle says to Philip, "You seen that cocksucker Joe Salerno around?" And Philip says, "Not the kid, but I see his old man all the time. He owns a motel down in Wildwood." It was almost like I could see the light bulb go off in my uncle's head. I could read him like a book. I knew what was coming next. Without hesitation, my uncle says to Philip, "I want you to go see the old man, and when you do, it's this." And he makes the sign of the gun. "We're going to teach these animals a lesson." Philip says, "Okay, Nick." And Salvi shoots me a look like, what the fuck is this? This was against the rules, and what we were supposed to stand for. Joe Salerno's father was a civilian. He wasn't involved with us or this thing, and now we're going to kill him because of something his son did. I knew this was a big, big mistake, but with my uncle, there was no questioning him. My uncle then turned to Salvi and said, "Everybody connected to our friend, the dwarf," meaning Harry Ricobene, "it's this." And he makes the sign of the gun. "All of them, his whole regime. You're in charge. Get it done." In a span of about 15 minutes, Nicodemo Little Nicky Scarfo had ordered the murders of Nicholas "Nick the Blade" Virgilio, Joe Salerno Sr., Harry the Hunchback Ricobene, and everyone connected to Ricobene's crew. My head was spinning. It was like he wanted to kill everyone and everything around him. It was a never-ending cycle with him, Wasting no time carrying out Scarfo's orders, Salvi Testa drafted a list of everyone connected to the Ricobenni faction and ordered that they be killed on sight. Within days, Salvatore Wayne Grand, an ambitious Scarfo assassin and trusted member of Salvi Testa's young executioner's crew, caught the hunchback all by himself on a South Philadelphia street corner, standing in a phone booth. The hunchback was a sitting duck. Wayne Grand ambushed Ricobenni, blasting him with 5 shots from a revolver at close range, but miraculously, the 73-year-old hunchback was able to wrestle the gun away from the 28-year-old Grand before he could finish the job. When Philadelphia police arrived moments later, they found Ricobenni leaning against the phone booth, bleeding, and holding his assassin's gun. When he was asked how he was able to wrestle the gun from his would-be killer, the hunchback responded, "He was done with it, so I took it." Ricobenni would later tell associates he knew that the weapon was a 6-shot revolver and had counted the 5 shots that had hit him. Knowing that there was 1 bullet left, Ricobenni stated he took the gun and attempted to shoot his assailant with the 6th bullet, but the gun was empty. So far, Harry the Hunchback was winning the war, and he was about to return fire with a strike of his own. While Scarfo's gunmen were out looking to kill everyone who was part of the Ricobenni faction, the Ricobennis were out looking to kill the men aligned with Scarfo. In late July, Joseph Padula and fellow Ricobenni loyalist Victor De Luca found Salvi Testa eating clams while sitting on a wooden crate in the middle of the famous 9th Street Italian market, and hit him with multiple shotgun blasts fired from their passing car. The hit team of Padula and De Luca had previously killed Scarfo's consigliere, Frank Monti, and now had wounded his street boss. The spry and vibrant Testa had half of his left shoulder blown off, but like the hunchback, he survived the attack, and after some time in the hospital, he was back on the street leading Little Nicky's assault on Ricobenni and his renegades. Shortly after the shooting of Salvi Testa in the Italian market, Joey Grand, a Scarfo hitman and the brother of Wayne Grand, fired multiple shots at Ricobenni as he sat behind the wheel of his Mercedes on a South Philadelphia street corner. However, once again, the old man survived, failing to take a single bullet. Things were at a standstill. Tensions were increasing, and the local press was having a field day as the streets of Philadelphia were engulfed in an all-out mob war. But killing Harry Ricobenni wasn't the only thing on Nicky Scarfo's mind. A few weeks later, on August 9th, 1982, Joseph Salerno Sr. was in the office of the motel he owned in Wildwood Crest, which was a short distance from the beach and the famous Wildwood Boardwalk, which was one of the most popular destinations at the Jersey Shore. The no vacancy sign was lit, yet a young man was pacing outside the office door wearing a jogging suit and a hooded sweatshirt. He was 19-year-old Philip Narducci, the son of the late Frank Chicky Narducci. When Joe Salerno Sr. opened the door, Narducci took a handgun out of his pocket and fired 2 shots at him, one of which struck him in the neck. Salerno Sr. was not only alive, but he was able to talk to the paramedics who arrived on the scene and took him to the hospital. While Philip Narducci, the young would-be mob assassin, had failed to kill Joe Salerno Sr., Nicky Scarfo's message had been delivered. If you betray me, I will find you and kill you, and if I cannot find you, I will kill your family. This ominous message still haunts many today, including Philip Leonetti, more than 2 decades after the shooting of Joe Salerno Sr. The shooting of Salerno Sr. made front-page news in Philadelphia and all throughout South Jersey, and the headlines were the kind that Little Nicky loved. The day after the shooting, there were more cops following us than ever. They were everywhere. My uncle said to me, "Look at all these cocksuckers watching us. They got nothing better to do." I knew we had made a big mistake when my uncle ordered the hit on Joe Salerno's father, and I think my uncle did too, but he would never say it. If Scarfo didn't know that trying to kill the father of a federally protected witness was likely to draw the ire of law enforcement, he would get the message loud and clear less than a week later, when the FBI arrested him on Georgia Avenue and whisked him away. We were standing in front of the office when all of a sudden here comes the cops up the street. It was a one-way, and they were coming in both directions, like 5 or 6 cars. It was just me and my uncle. There's like 20 guys. They all got guns. My uncle says, "What the fuck is all this?" And they moved in and grabbed him, handcuffed him, and threw him in the back of one of the cars. They grabbed me, but they let me go once he was in the car. They were only there for him. Before they pulled off, I heard him say, "Call Bobby," and that was it. They were gone. It was the FBI. I knew he was in trouble. The U.S. Attorney's Office in Camden had filed a motion to revoke SCARFO's bail pending appeal because they claimed to have evidence that he had violated the conditions of his bail by associating with convicted felons. The judge took the unusual step of issuing a body warrant for SCARFO in lieu of scheduling a hearing first. SCARFO was taken directly to the Camden County Jail and placed in solitary confinement to await his hearing. The next day I went to Philadelphia to see Bobby Simone, and Bobby told me, "This is because of what happened down in Wildwood. There's too much heat." I told Bobby, "You gotta get me in to see my uncle. I need to talk to him." 2 days later, Bobby arranged for me to visit my uncle inside the jail. It had been almost 10 years since I had visited my uncle in jail when he was in Yardville, and I found myself thinking of how much had happened over those 10 years. How many guys had been killed, all the stuff we had done, and how things seemed to be spiraling out of control. Then my uncle suddenly appeared on the other side of the glass and picked up the phone. I could tell right away he was agitated. He started complaining right away. He said, "Tell Bobby to get me out of this place right away. This place is a fucking toilet, and I cannot stay here. Tell him I don't give a fuck where they send me. They can send me to Russia. I don't give a fuck, but I cannot stay here." I said, "Okay, I'll go see him." My uncle takes his finger and points at me and says, "On this side, and the guy over the bridge on that side. Got it?" And I nodded my head, yes. He was saying he wanted me to run everything on this side of the bridge, meaning New Jersey, while he was gone, and he wanted Chucky to run everything on the other side of the bridge, meaning Philadelphia. He then took his hand and held it out like he was trying to demonstrate someone's height. He made the height very low, and I knew immediately that he was talking about Harry Ricobene. He said, "Tell your friend over there that I said him and his friends need to start acting right and stop playing games." He's looking at me through the glass, and his eyes are really big as he is saying it, meaning for me to tell Salvi that him and his crew need to start killing the Ricobenes and to stop botching the hits. My uncle always talked in circles, but I knew what he was saying because I knew what he was thinking. Then he said, "Bobby says I'm looking at 1.5 years," and he shrugged his shoulders like he didn't give a fuck. But I know he did. My uncle hated jail. All he ever did was bitch and complain when he was locked up. Now he's going on about the food, the guards, the noise, the black kids with their boom boxes, the dust, and all I'm thinking is how great it is going to be to not have to deal with him for the next 18 months. I couldn't wait for them to ship him the fuck out. I was hoping they'd send him to Alaska. 2 days later, Nicodemos Scarfo's bail was revoked, and he was immediately driven to the Philadelphia International Airport, where he boarded a plane with 2 U.S. Marshals and was flown directly to El Paso, Texas, and sent to the La Tuna Federal Correctional Center to serve his sentence. Little Nicky was a long way from Atlantic City and would stay there for the rest of 1982, for all of 1983, and into 1984. In his absence, the murder and mayhem would continue, but for his nephew, Philip Leonetti, life was about to change. The day after they shipped my uncle to Texas, I remember waking up and I couldn't have been happier. I felt free for the first time in my life. I can't even describe the feeling. It was as if I had beaten cancer and had a new lease on life. I remember going up to the boardwalk and walking all the way from Georgia Avenue down to the end of the boardwalk in Ventnor as if I didn't have a care in the world. I was just walking and staring out at the ocean. At that moment, I didn't give a fuck about my uncle, Harry Ricobene, the mob, none of it. It was like I was living a different life. That night, I took my girl out for a nice dinner at the Knife and Fork, which was one of the best restaurants in Atlantic City. I was constantly running around day and night with my uncle 24/7. He never shut down, so I never shut down. And now, here I was, relaxing, having a night out. I couldn't remember the last time I had been out with her where I wasn't worried about what time I had to get home or what time I had to meet someone for my uncle. My girl told me that I was smiling the whole night. Philip Leonetti's girlfriend was accustomed to his daily routine, as she lived directly across the street from the SCARFO compound on Georgia Avenue. She was also somewhat familiar with the life of a mobster, as she had once dated Vincent Falcone, and was dating him when Philip killed him in December 1979. She was the one who came by the office and asked if I knew where Vince was right after I killed him. Maria. Me and her started dating a few months after I killed Vince, and at the time she had no idea that I had killed him. We never talked about him. It was as if he had never existed. In addition to having a steady girlfriend for more than a year, Philip Leonetti had something else in his personal life, an 8-year-old son. Philip Jr. was born in March 1974, right before my 21st birthday. I wasn't much of a father in the beginning, because I had put La Cosa Nostra first, which is what you are supposed to do when you take your oath. This thing is supposed to come before everything, even your family and your own kids, and for me, it did. But now I was starting to have second thoughts about this life, mainly because I was so sick of being around my uncle and just the way that he was, all the killings, all of the treachery. Maria and I started taking little Philip places like the movies, the Ocean City Boardwalk, the Philadelphia Zoo, things I would never do when my uncle was around. He'd go crazy if he found out I took my kid to the zoo. He would have said, "What are you, a jerk-off? Going there and looking at animals?" But I was having the time of my life with Maria and Philip. I never felt so alive in all of my life. Just as Philip Leonetti was starting to get accustomed to life without his uncle, a phone call from an angry and agitated Nicky Scarfo from a Texas prison would snap him back to reality. I was in my grandmother's apartment with my mother and little Philip, and the phone rings, and my grandmother asked me to pick it up, and it says, "You have a collect call from Nick." I almost got sick to my stomach hearing his voice. I accepted the charges, and before he was connected, the operator said, "This call is from an inmate at a federal institution, and it will be monitored and recorded." And the next thing I hear is him screaming into the phone, "Where the fuck have you been? I've been trying to get you for 2 fucking weeks and you are nowhere to be found. Did you go to Philadelphia? Did you do what I asked? I'm sitting down here like a jerk-off while you're out gallivanting." I cut him right off and said, "I've been busy with Scarf Inc. I've got a couple new jobs." And he says, "Fuck Scarf Inc. and fuck those jobs." He is still hollering into the phone, and I hand the phone to my grandmother and say, "Here, you talk to him." And I left the house. When I got outside, I knew my uncle was steaming. I had never talked to him like that, or even talked back to him. But I was sick and tired of all of his ranting and raving. While I'm standing outside the office, who comes walking up the street but the Blade? Now, according to my uncle, I'm supposed to kill him. I say, "Hey, Nick, want to grab something to eat?" And he says, "Sure, Philip." And we walked to Caesar's. Me and him had been there a few times, and we were there together on the night that Ange had gotten killed. While we're eating, the Blade says, "I know your uncle's mad at me." I say, "Nick, my uncle's mad at everybody. He's mad at me, too." And we both started laughing. And he said, "I know, Philip. It's just hard for me sometimes." You see, the Blade had a young son who had drowned and died, and the Blade used to carry a picture of him around, and he would get fall-down drunk and talk about what had happened with his son. And then after a while he'd start trouble and get into a fight. I understood why he was the way he was. It wasn't his fault. Philip Leonetti was no longer his uncle's robot. He started thinking for himself and making his own decisions. And killing Nick the Blade wasn't going to happen. A few days later, Chucky drives down from Philadelphia, and me, him, and Lawrence go to Angeloni's for dinner. He says, "Bobby Simone came to see me. He talked to your uncle, and your uncle wants you and Bobby to go down to Texas to see him." I said to Chucky, "Hey, Chuck, you want to come down with us? We'll have a good time." And Chucky said, "He didn't ask for me, just you and Bobby." And we both laughed. If anyone knew my uncle besides me, it was Chucky. He and Chucky had been hanging since the 50s. Chucky knew my uncle like the back of his hand. I think, like me, Chucky was enjoying not having my uncle around. So the next day I'm in the office and the phone rings, and it's my uncle. It's the same routine with the collect call, only this time, when he gets on, he's not screaming. He says, "I'm glad I got you. How are things going? How is Scarf Inc.?" Now I know he could care less about Scarf Inc., but this is his way of breaking the ice a little bit. I say, "Scarf Inc. is good. Everything is good." He says, "Good. I'm glad to hear it." He says, "I want you and Bobby to come down and see me. You'll like it down here. It's right on the border of Mexico. The Rio Grande is right there." I say, "Oh yeah?" And he says, "Yeah." I tell him, "We will set it up and get down there before Christmas." And my uncle seemed happy with that. I'm thinking to myself, now we're making small talk. I think my uncle knew I was getting sick of all the bullshit. Then I told him I had dinner with Chucky and Lawrence, and he asked how they were doing. Again, more small talk. And then I couldn't help myself. I said, "Guess who else I had dinner with?" And he said, "Who?" And I said, "The Blade." He said, "You had dinner with him?" I said, "Yeah, we went to Caesar's. He apologized for all of that trouble, and he's trying to clean his act up." Now, by saying this, I am telling my uncle that I am not going to kill the Blade. Surprisingly, my uncle says, "Good, good. Tell him I said hello, and tell him I said to knock it off with the drinking and to start coming around more." While Nicky Scarfo seemed to be somewhat humbled by being away from his gang, Philip Leonetti knew that it, like his little break, wouldn't last long. I knew it was only a matter of time before he was screaming and yelling again. That's just how he was. In the meantime, it was back to work for me. With Nicky Scarfo tucked away in a dusty federal prison over 2,000 miles away in El Paso, Texas, his longtime friend and underboss, Salvatore Chucky Merlino, was calling the shots on the streets in South Philadelphia, while his 29-year-old nephew, Philip Leonetti, was overseeing the family's New Jersey operation. On most days I was in the office or I was taking meetings with guys in restaurants. I'd usually have either Lawrence or Saul Kane with me, and sometimes the Blade. Blackie Napoli was coming down from Newark twice a month to bring my uncle's money, and the guys from Trenton were coming down once or twice a month. I was meeting with the Tachetta brothers, who were with Tumac Achaturo and the North Jersey branch of the Lucchese crime family, and I was seeing a lot of Sammy the Bull Gravano, who was with the Gambinos. Me and Sammy started getting real close. He'd always stop by the office if he came to Atlantic City, and me and him would go out to dinner. When all of these guys would come down to Atlantic City, out of respect, they would check in with my uncle. Now, with him gone, they were checking in with me. We'd go out to dinner. We'd talk about who was doing what, who was making moves. Most of the time, I'd get an envelope with cash, usually a few $1,000s, as tribute money for my uncle. Even with little Nicky behind bars, the Scarfo mob continued to earn, and earn big. Leonetti estimates that he collected almost $3 million in cash for his uncle during the 17 months that he was behind bars. The street tax money coming down every month from Philadelphia could range from $50,000 to $100,000. It depended on what was going on. Don't forget, we still had our bookmaking and loan sharking operations, and we were involved in a million other deals. Making money wasn't the problem for us. I'd always pick the money up directly from Chucky, and I'd bring it home, and I would count it out with Nicky Jr. Without fail, no matter what the amount was, it would always be light a few $100s. I knew Chucky wasn't skimming $300 or $400. He was making tens of thousands of dollars himself. I believed it was his son Joey who was robbing the money. Joey Merlino was always a no-good kid. He was a punk even as a teenager, 18 or 19 years old. He was constantly starting trouble in Atlantic City, and my uncle would always make me straighten it out. He would bet with bookmakers who were with us and not pay them when he lost. Then he would lie and say that it wasn't him. On top of that, I believe he was robbing the money that was coming down from Philadelphia to Atlantic City, from me and my uncle. Around that time, I wanted to kill him, but he was Chucky's son, and I know there was no way my uncle would sanction it. At that time, my uncle liked this kid very much because the two of them were very much alike, and Joey was always respectful around my uncle. Plus, Chucky was my uncle's best friend, and he was the underboss, and Joey and Nicky Jr. were also the best of friends. I thought he was no good, and if I could have, I would have killed him. While Philip Leonetti was busy in Atlantic City, Salvi Testa and his young executioner's crew were still on the front lines of the SCARFO mob's war with the Rico Bene faction. A couple times a week, my uncle would call and say things like, "Did Salvi clean that boat yet? Tell him to get the boat clean," which was his way of saying tell Salvi and his guys to get the Rico Benes. He would say, "Tell him the whole boat, top to bottom, clean the whole thing," which meant he wanted everyone dead, Harry and his whole crew. In December 1982, Harry the Hunchback Rico Bene was jailed on a parole violation for possession of a handgun during a traffic stop. Already convicted on a slew of federal racketeering charges, the Hunchback was out on an appeal bond when he violated. Rico Bene was immediately whisked away to jail, and like his arch-nemesis, Nicky Scarfo, the Hunchback was forced to command his assault effort from behind bars. Right before Christmas, me and Bobby Simone flew down to Texas to see my uncle, like I had promised him. He seemed to be in good spirits because he knew we were making a lot of money, but he was still hell-bent on killing all of Harry's guys, even with Harry in jail. When we got down to Texas and went to the jail, they would only let Bobby in, and told me I was prohibited from having any unsupervised contact with my uncle. I said no problem, and I told Bobby to meet me back at the hotel when he was done. Truth be told, I was okay not seeing him. I actually preferred it. I was enjoying my time away from him, especially my time with Maria and little Philip. I decided to drive around a little bit, and boy, was I out of place. It was all cowboys and Mexicans down there. I felt like I was on another planet. I knew my uncle couldn't have been happy in there, and now I knew what he meant when he said that the other prisoners in La Tuna were not our kind of people. My uncle had told me that the whole place was full of Mexican guys and black guys. He said, "There's not two white guys in this whole fucking place." The Mexican mafia was very big down there, and there were a lot of fights in that jail, a lot of stabbings. My uncle kept to himself while he was in there, but he had two Mexican guys who were with him the whole time he was there. He called them his pistoleros, and they served as his bodyguards. He'd have me send money to put on their books or do things for their families. These guys were dirt poor, but they were loyal, and like my uncle, they were stone killers. My uncle told me when he got out, he said, "I wish I had 10 more guys just like them." So I'm back at the hotel, and I'm in the lobby having a drink, and in comes Bobby back from the prison and seeing my uncle. I say, "Hey, Bob, how did it go?" And he says, "You know how he is." And we both smiled. He said, "Let me go upstairs and freshen up a bit, and I'll be right down." Bobby and I were staying in the best suite in the hotel, but remember, we were in El Paso, not Beverly Hills. 5 minutes later, Bobby pages me, and he's out of breath, and I can barely make out what he's saying. He tells me that when he put the key in the room, he sees 2 guys in the room dressed like maintenance workers, and that they seemed startled to see him and hurried out of the room once he arrived. Now, my mind is racing. I'm thinking, is this a hit? Was someone there to kill me? There was no reason to kill Bobby. He was our lawyer. No one wanted to kill him, except maybe the prosecutors and judges he dealt with. But I was a captain in La Cosa Nostra, and my uncle was the boss, and here I am 2,000 miles away from Atlantic City. Like Harry Rico Bene in that phone booth, I realized I was essentially a sitting duck. 2 minutes later, Bobby's down in the lobby, and I tell him, "We're out of here. We need to pack our bags and go back home." And Bobby agrees. We were supposed to be there all weekend, and Bobby was supposed to go see my uncle the next morning. We went to the room and packed our stuff and drove right to the airport and got on the first plane back to Philadelphia. On the plane, I tell Bobby, That was either a hit or the FBI trying to bug our room. Either way, I don't like it. And Bobby agreed. When he arrived in Philadelphia, Leonetti rounded up Chucky Merlino and Salvi Testa and told them what had happened in El Paso. We all agreed that we needed to be on guard and make sure everybody in the family was on point. The next day, my uncle called and wanted to know what happened with the second visit, and he was stunned when I told him what had happened in the room. I could hear it in his voice. He said, "Jesus Christ, did you get a look at them?" And I told him, "No, only Bobby saw them." He said, "You made the right move leaving. Make sure everyone back home tightens their belts. I don't like what I'm hearing here." It was never determined if this was a botched hit attempt on Philip Leonetti or the FBI attempting to plant a bug in his hotel suite, but it was determined that the two men inside the hotel room were not maintenance workers. We checked it out at the hotel, and they told us there was no work being done in any of the rooms, and Bobby contacted a lawyer down there to look into it, and the lawyer told him the same thing. Life in the mob was certainly unpredictable. From behind bars, Nicky Scarfo was sending messages to his nephew Philip Leonetti and to his street boss, Salvi Testa, to clean the boat, and to make sure they cleaned the whole boat, top to bottom. Scarfo wasn't referring to the boat that Testa kept in a Ventnor Marina, nor was he talking about the cabin cruiser he and Leonetti had docked out by Harrah's Casino in Atlantic City. He was cryptically instructing Testa and his young executioner's crew to finish the Ricobene War by killing anyone and everyone connected to rival Harry the Hunchback Ricobene, who, like Scarfo, was behind bars. As 1983 got underway, the Scarfo mob was back to doing what it did best: killing people. On January 27th, the body of Robert Hornickel, a low-level South Philadelphia drug dealer who had run afoul of Scarfo's street tax, was found in the trunk of his car. With Harry the Hunchback Ricobene locked up, his brother Mario, Sonny Ricobene, was running the gang. This made him Salvi Testa's #1 target, as the Scarfo mob hitmen escalated their murderous efforts to appease their jailed boss. Pat Spirito was one of the guys in Giancalini's crew. I never liked him. I thought he was a crybaby and didn't think he was much of a gangster. But he was a decent earner, and he led one of the crews that was out collecting the street tax. Salvi gave Pat and his crew the Sonny Ricobene contract. At the time, Pat had Nicky Crow, Charlie White, and Junior Stano in his crew, and they all reported to Giancalini. That was about to change. We were getting reports that Pat and his guys were dogging it, not doing what they were ordered to do. None of them guys in that crew were killers, except for Charlie White. Pat, the Crow, Junior, they were all neighborhood guys, knock-around guys. They weren't gangsters. So one day I'm with Chucky, Salvi, and Giancalini, and we decide that Pat Spirito needs to go, that we need to kill him to send a message to everyone in our family that we mean business, and that an order is an order. I knew my uncle wanted to kill Pat since the day he made him. After he got made, Pat came up to my uncle and said, "You know, Nick, you should think about making Patty Specs a captain." And my uncle just stared at him, like he couldn't believe this guy who just got made was telling him how to run the family. When he walked away, my uncle said, "Do you believe the balls on this fucking guy?" And Chucky said, "Nick, maybe we should get one of them suggestion boxes and let the guys give us ideas on how to run things, like they do at restaurants." Me and Chucky were laughing, and my uncle said, "Where do these fucking guys come from?" So Chucky ordered the Crow and Charlie White to kill Pat. A few weeks later, on April 29th, Charlie White Iannici, who was armed with a .38, shot Pasquale Pat the Cat Spirito in the back of the head as he sat in a parked car in South Philadelphia with Nicholas Nick the Crow Caramandi. As the war with the Ricobenes continued, it became obvious that the Ricobenes were losing their momentum. Harry the Hunchback was in jail, as were his top two soldiers, Joseph Padula and Victor DeLuca, both of whom were locked up for the attempted murder of Salvi Testa. Botched or aborted hits from both sides ensued for the next several months, until a Scarfo hit team supervised by Testa pumped multiple gunshots into Ricobene's soldier Frank Martinez as he got behind the wheel of his truck to drive to work on a foggy October morning in 1983. Two of the shooters on the hit team that got Martinez were the Narducci brothers, Chicky's sons, Frank Jr. and Philip. Frank Jr. had helped Salvi Testa set up and kill Rocco Marinucci in retaliation for Marinucci's involvement in the bombing that killed his father, Philip Chicken Man Testa. Frank Narducci Jr. gladly assisted Testa, despite knowing that Testa had personally murdered his father, Frank Sr., for the exact same reason that Marinucci had been killed, because the elder Narducci had also been involved in the murder of Philip Testa. Philip Narducci was the gunman who shot Joe Salerno Sr. in Wildwood Crest on direct orders from Nicky SCARFO himself, despite the fact it was SCARFO who had ordered his father killed only 6 months earlier. In a piece of twisted, blood-soaked underworld irony, Joe Salerno Sr. had been one of the first neighbors to find Chicky Narducci as he lay dying in the gutter, and the elder Salerno even went and got a neighborhood priest to come and read Narducci's last rites. Now, the Narducci brothers were two of SCARFO's go-to soldiers, members of Salvi Testa's young executioner's crew. They were two of Salvi's top guys, and my uncle had told them both before he went to jail that he wasn't going to hold them responsible for what their father had done. So despite the fact that we killed their father, they were with us. The reality is, they didn't have a choice. Years later, a witness who would testify against SCARFO, Leonetti, and the Narducci brothers would tell FBI agents that he was baffled as to how the Narduccis could swear blood allegiance to the man who had killed their father. "Never in a million fucking years will I understand that one," the witness would say in one of his debriefing sessions. Frank Martinez would survive the October 1983 ambush, but the incident served to break the street war wide open in favor of SCARFO and would foreshadow similar events with different outcomes over the next 2 months. On November 3rd, Philip Narducci and another member of Salvi Testa's young executioner's crew, Nicholas Nicky Whip Milano, the younger brother of Testa's close friend Eugene Gino Milano, shot and killed Sammy Tamburino, a Ricobene's loyalist who had previously been aligned with SCARFO. Tamburino was killed in a southwest Philadelphia arcade that served as his headquarters, and the killing took place in front of his mother, who stood and watched in horror. When Tamburino decided to shift his allegiance from SCARFO to Ricobene, he did so in an effort to make more money, by filling the void that was left when the hunchback, Joseph Padula, and Victor DeLuca went to jail. Tamburino had become close with Sonny Ricobene, and he and Frank Martinez stood to inherit what remained of the lucrative Ricobene crew if Sonny Ricobene were to join his brother Harry behind bars. Mario Sonny Ricobene had been arrested and charged in a massive 1980 federal racketeering case. Ricobene's co-defendants included Angelo Bruno, Philip Testa, Chicky Narducci, and Pat Spirito, all of whom were killed either before the trial or prior to sentencing. Sonny Ricobene's brother, Harry the Hunchback, was also convicted. The bail he put up while his appeal was pending got revoked when Philadelphia police discovered a gun in his car during a routine traffic stop. Only Sonny Ricobene and SCARFO capo Joseph Chicky Ciancalini remained free on bail pending appeal, but both knew their days as free men were numbered. A month later, SCARFO's men would finally hit the jackpot, finding and killing one of the Hunchback's own flesh and blood, his brother, Robert Bobby Ricobene. After stalking him the entire day of December 6th, a SCARFO death squad, made up of Charlie White Iannici, Joseph Joey Pungitori, and Francis Faffy Iannarella, caught Bobby exiting his car in the presence of his elderly mother. Similar to the Tamburino hit, Little Nicky's men disregarded the callousness of rubbing out someone in front of his mother and attacked their prey on sight. Armed with a shotgun, Iannarella, a young, street-savvy, second-generation South Philadelphia gangster, approached Ricobene and his mother. When Ricobene spotted Iannarella, he took off, jumping a nearby fence in an attempt to escape the onslaught. His efforts would prove futile. Taking aim at his fleeing target, the former U.S. soldier, who had been decorated for his service in Vietnam before enlisting in Nicky Scarfo's La Cosa Nostra army, Fafi Iannarella blasted Ricobene to oblivion with a shot to the back of the head, dropping Bobby Ricobene as he was trying to climb the fence. Ricobene's mother, who tried to wrestle the shotgun from him. The scene was eerily reminiscent of the time her son Harry had wrestled a handgun from his assailant in a phone booth following an attempt on his life. Iannarella would take the butt of his shotgun and strike Ricobene's elderly mother in the face, sending the hysterically crying woman crashing to the ground. In a sick and perverted way, the murders of Bobby Ricobene and Sammy Tamburino in front of their mothers, like the shooting of Joe Salerno Sr., highlighted what had become the Scarfo family's specialty: raw, vicious, visceral, in-your-face, wanton violence. Honor and respect seemed to be a thing of the past. I wasn't happy when I found out that these two guys had been killed in front of their mothers, and I didn't agree with the shooting of Joe Salerno's father. But you have to understand, the Ricobene guys were trying to kill us. So, it was kill or be killed. This was a war in every sense of the word. Just like my uncle was ordering us to kill them from his jail cell, the hunchback was doing the same from his. Everyone knew the stakes were life or death. Scarfo, on the other hand, was ecstatic following the two high-profile mob murders. He would get the Philadelphia Inquirer in the mail, but it was always a few days behind. We couldn't talk on the phone and say, "Hey, we killed Bobby Ricobene today." So he'd make a comment and say, "How about the Eagles? They are playing terrific, aren't they?" That's what he would say if he was happy with what we were doing. If he wasn't happy, it would be, "How about these fucking Eagles? The whole team is lousy from top to bottom. They need to get rid of everybody and start over." That meant he was disgusted that we weren't doing our jobs. Following the shooting of Frank Martinez and the murders of Bobby Ricobene and Sammy Tamburino, the Ricobene faction seemed to be on its last leg. But a wounded animal is a dangerous animal, and Harry's gang wasn't done yet. A few days after Bobby Ricobene's murder, Salvi Testa was driving through South Philadelphia with members of his young executioner's crew, Joseph Joey Pungitori, and the Milano brothers, Gino and Nicky Whip. Their car became boxed in by another car that was loaded with 4 Ricobene soldiers who jumped out of their car and opened fire in broad daylight. Luckily for Testa and his men, nobody was hit in the fusillade of bullets, and it proved to be one of the last assaults in the carnage-filled conflict that had rocked the underworld in South Philadelphia. There would be, however, one more casualty in the Ricobene War. A few days after Harry's guys tried to kill Salvi and Joe Punge, I drove up to Philly with Lawrence to go see a jeweler I did business with on Jewelers Row. It was a few weeks before Christmas, and I was going to pick up a watch for Maria. Me and Lawrence met Salvi at Virgilio's, and we went and saw the jeweler. I think we may have had Fathy with us. As we were leaving, we passed by a jewelry shop that was owned by Sonny Ricobene's son, Enrico. Salvi said, "Let's go in there and see what's on this kid's brain," meaning to see what he was thinking. I knocked on the window, and I saw Sonny's son coming towards the door, and then he froze when he saw who it was. I said, "Come on, we just want to talk to you," and I saw him retreat to the back of the store. With these jewelry stores, you had to be buzzed in. You couldn't just walk in the store. A few seconds later, a guy who worked there came to the window and said, "If you don't leave, we're calling the police." So we left. Moments later, Enrico Ricobene walked into his office at the rear of the store and put a pistol to the side of his head and pulled the trigger. He was so frightened by the sight of Philip Leonetti and Salvi Testa that he killed himself. He was 27 years old. Salvi Testa was now bragging. "We don't have to kill these guys anymore. They do it themselves." When the news of his nephew's suicide reached him in prison, Harry the Hunchback's heart and will were shattered. Things had gone too far. Both his brother and now his young nephew were dead. He was ready to give in and wave the white flag. During the first week of 1984, the hunchback sent word to what remained of his crew that the war was over. Nicodemo "Little Nicky" Scarfo had won the war. The victory entitled Scarfo to everything that belonged to the Ricobenes, a treasure trove of illegal operations that he and his men would devour and add to their already overflowing stable of cash cow rackets. But all was not well in the ranks of the tumultuous Scarfo mob, despite the fact that it had won the Ricobene War and that Little Nicky was set to be released from prison in a matter of weeks. Those in Scarfo's inner circle didn't know it yet, but the plot would soon thicken and was about to get even more treacherous than it already was. The rules and parameters that Gotti spoke of included one edict that members of La Cosa Nostra routinely ignored: the prohibition against participating in the distribution of narcotics. Dealing drugs was an absolute violation of the rules, plain and simple. My uncle and I were 100% against anyone who sold drugs or used drugs. When my uncle became boss, he brought everyone in and told them the rules. A few days after that meeting, Raymond Long John Martirano asked to meet with my uncle, and I arranged for them to meet. Long John said, "Nick, I just want to make sure we are on the same page regarding the policy on drugs." And my uncle said, "I don't understand what you're asking." And Long John said, "Ange had the same policy, but he and I were heavily involved in the drug trade. We made a lot of money selling drugs together." My uncle and I were both shocked, and my uncle said, "You and Ange sold drugs together?" And Long John said, "Nick, the entire time Ange was boss, he was the biggest drug dealer in Philadelphia. Him, Phil Testa, and Caponegro. That's where they made most of their money." My uncle changed his tone and said very seriously, "Raymond, listen to me. If anyone in this family is involved with drugs from this day forward, and I find out about it, it's this." And he made the sign of the gun. By the summer of 1986, various members of the SCARFO organization had successfully circumvented the edict against being involved with the distribution of drugs by shaking down drug dealers and loaning them money, which, in essence, financed their operations. My uncle said it was okay to shake down the drug dealers with the street tax, and it was okay to lend them money with our loan sharking operation, but we were forbidden from getting directly involved with what they were doing. Many La Cosa Nostra bosses, like Lucky Luciano, Vito Genovese, and even Vincent the Chin Gigante, had been convicted of dealing heroin in their younger days, and black drug dealers were making piles of money selling cocaine in the 1980s. Several members of the SCARFO organization became directly and indirectly involved in the manufacturing and distribution of methamphetamine, more commonly known as meth or crank or speed, by obtaining and reselling phenyl-2-propanone, P2P, to cookers who used P2P oil to make meth. A gallon of P2P could be obtained overseas for under $2,000 and resold to dealers in the United States for $20,000 or more. It was an offer that some in the SCARFO mob couldn't refuse. The first sign of trouble came when Saul Kane got indicted for labor racketeering with Stevie Traits and the Roofers Union, and then got indicted on a federal drug case, which was nonsense. Saul told me he never sold drugs a day in his life, and I believe him to this day. The feds alleged that Kane, who was 51 at the time, was the leader of an international drug operation that specialized in importing P2P into the United States and then wholesaling it to various drug operations. The indictment alleged that the operation made in excess of $24 million. Almost as quickly as Saul Kane and several of his top associates were rounded up, one of them began cooperating, and Kane was held without bail. Several other alleged Philadelphia meth dealers were rounded up in separate indictments that charged them with importing P2P and distributing meth, and shortly after they were charged, Several of these individuals began to cooperate and point the finger at various made members of the SCARFO mob, including Ralph Jr. Steno, Charles Charlie White Iannici, Thomas Tommy Del Giorno, and Nicholas Nicky Crow Caramandi, as being directly or indirectly involved in importing, manufacturing, and distributing both P2P and methamphetamine. Indictments were being prepared, but for tactical reasons they were kept under seal. In addition to his involvement in the P2P case, Nicholas Nick the Crow Caramandi had not heeded Nicky Scarfo's warning about being careful in his dealings with Philadelphia City Councilman Leland Beloff. The Crow was caught trying to extort $1 million from a prominent Philadelphia land developer. Using and mentioning his connections to both Leland Beloff and Nicky Scarfo in his dealings with a representative for the developer, who was actually an undercover FBI agent. On June 27, 1986, Caramandi was arrested, but 11 days later the charges against him were dropped. The Crow comes down to Atlantic City to see my uncle and tells him that the case is bullshit and that's why the feds dropped the charges. But my uncle spoke to Bobby Simone, and Bobby told him that he thought the feds were going to re-indict the case down the road, and that their ultimate goal was to include my uncle in the indictment, even though my uncle never met the developer or the undercover agent. My uncle didn't seem to be too concerned about it, and neither was I. Another problem Nicky Scarfo was having at the time was with Tommy Del Giorno, one of the men supervising his mob's street operation in South Philadelphia. The same thing that had happened towards the end with Chucky was happening with Tommy Del. He was drunk 7 days a week, and my uncle took him down, just like he did to Chucky. My uncle said to me, "We got to get this thing back on track, from top to bottom." He knew that our organization was in bad shape. What Scarfo had no way of knowing at that time was exactly how bad things actually were. With Tommy Del Giorno taken down from captain to soldier, the 39-year-old Francis Faffy Iannarella became the family's new Philadelphia street boss. There was just a sense that things were falling apart around us. It's hard to explain, but the regime just wasn't the same. After Salvi got killed, and then the thing with Chucky and Lawrence, it just kept going downhill from there. And things were about to go from bad to worse. In October 1986, Nicholas Nick the Crow Caramandi was rearrested in the extortion case involving Willard Rouse, the real estate developer he tried to shake down for $1 million. He was held in a Philadelphia prison without bail. At Caramandi's bail hearing, the U.S. Attorney laid out for the judge the government's belief that Caramandi was a career criminal and made member of the Scarfo mob, while also claiming that Caramandi figured prominently in both the P2P case, which remained under seal, and the 1983 murder of Pat Spirito. Caramandi, who had known Scarfo since the early 1970s, understood that the volatile mob boss was furious that Caramandi had talked so recklessly in mentioning both Scarfo's name and La Cosa Nostra when dealing with the man he was trying to extort, who was both an FBI agent and was wearing a wire. My uncle had told him to be careful and use his head, but the Crow decided to act like a gangster, which he wasn't, and he started shooting off at the mouth, playing a role, and he buried himself. On November 3, 1986, the New Jersey Attorney General's office unsealed an indictment against Nicky Scarfo, Philip Leonetti, and 16 others, charging them with racketeering, money laundering, and bookmaking. The backbone of the case was a series of secretly recorded wiretap conversations in which a drunken Tommy Del Giorno openly discussed mob business and expressed his dissatisfaction with his mob superiors, namely Little Nicky and Crazy Phil. On the eve of the indictment being announced, detectives from the New Jersey State Police visited Del Giorno at his South Philadelphia home and played the tapes for him in an effort to turn him into a cooperating witness. Tommy Del knew that once Scarfo and Leonetti heard the tapes, he would become a dead man walking, as the two mob leaders predictably made bail shortly after they were arraigned, posting $400,000 and $300,000 respectively. The other 16 defendants named in the indictment were given court dates for early January. A week later, Tommy Del Giorno became the first made member of the SCARFO mob to defect from La Cosa Nostra and enter into an agreement to cooperate with the government. 3 days later, Nicholas "Nick the Crow" Caramandi would become the second. Both men were now cooperating with the FBI and the U.S. Attorney's Office in the multiple investigations that were ongoing against Nicodemo Scarfo, Philip Leonetti, and the entire Philadelphia, Atlantic City La Cosa Nostra, investigations which included all of the unsolved mob murders that Scarfo and Leonetti had ordered and participated in, dating back to their early Atlantic City days in the late 1970s, up through the Frankie Flowers murder in July 1985. I remember Bobby Simone came down after the news of Tommy Dell and Nick the Crow broke and said, "Nick, it's not good." And my uncle knew it. My uncle said, "How long before they come to get me?" And Bobby said, "It could be a day, could be a week, could be a year. They're definitely coming." The next day, me and my uncle went to Angeloni's for lunch, and the mood was very somber. He knew his days were numbered. He told me, "If they lock me up and I can't make bail, and you're not in the cell next to me, you're in charge for as long as I'm locked up. You will get messages either directly from me through Bobby or through Nicky Jr." I tried to lighten the mood by saying, "Uncle Nick, you think any jury is going to believe Tommy Dell or Nicky the Crow? It'll be just like the Falcone case with Joe Salerno. We'll get the best lawyers and we will fight them and we will win, just like we did before." Now, at this time, between the two of us, we had almost $3 million, and my uncle said, "You're right, fuck 'em. Fuck Tommy Dell, fuck Nicky the Crow, and fuck the feds. Fuck 'em all. We ain't laying down for none of them." As the feds meticulously debriefed Del Giorno and Caramandi in separate locations, they were obtaining an insight into the dark world of La Cosa Nostra under the despotic Nicodemo Little Nicky Scarfo. Right before Christmas of that year, 1986, me and my uncle headed down to Florida, to Casablanca South for a few days. Spike was down there, and he tried to cheer us up, but it was gloom and doom ever since we found out that those guys had flipped. I went back to Atlantic City right before New Year's, 1987, and my uncle stayed down there a few more days with his girlfriend at the time, who we all called Chicago. On January 7th, 1987, the remaining 16 defendants in the New Jersey state racketeering indictment were all arraigned and subsequently released on bail. Among those charged were Fafi Iannarella, Scarfo's Philadelphia street boss, Joseph Joe Punge Pungatori, Joseph Grand and his brother Salvatore Wayne Grand, all four of whom were allegedly involved in the Salvatore Testa murder, and Joseph Legambi, the alleged triggerman in the Frankie Flowers murder. This arraignment took place 5 years to the day that Frank Chicky Narducci was ambushed and murdered by Salvi Testa and Joseph Joe Punge Pungatori for his role in the murder of Testa's father, Philip Testa. Those 5 years essentially defined the rise and the fall of Little Nicky Scarfo's mafia empire. The next day, January 8th, 1987, would mark Nicodemo Scarfo's final day as a free man. As the 57-year-old mafia don emerged from an Air Brit flight from Fort Lauderdale to Atlantic City, he was swarmed by a half-dozen FBI agents and taken into custody on charges that he had conspired with Nicholas "Nick the Crow" Caramandi and Philadelphia City Councilman Leland Beloff in the attempted $1 million extortion from Philadelphia land developer Willard Rouse. Sporting a business suit and a cashmere overcoat, Scarfo had a deep winter tan as he smiled for reporters and photographers documenting his arrival and subsequent arrest. Scarfo was taken to FBI headquarters in Linwood, New Jersey for processing, and then held overnight at the Cape May County Jail, some 30 miles south of Atlantic City. Scarfo would then be transferred to a detention center in Philadelphia to await a bail hearing, and less than a week later, Little Nicky was formally denied bail. His 33-year-old nephew, Philip Leonetti, was now the acting boss of the Philadelphia Atlantic City mob. When my uncle went to jail, we were in bad shape. It wasn't like when he was in La Tuna and me, Chucky, Lawrence, and Salvi kept things going. This time around, there was nobody left. Salvi was dead, Chucky was in a jail cell in Camden, and Lawrence wasn't really around anymore. It was basically me and Faffy, and guys like Joe Punge. We all had cases pending, and we knew we were going to get locked up. It was only a matter of time. For the first 2 months of 1987, Philip Leonetti attempted to use men like Francis Faffy Iannarella in Philadelphia and Pasquale Patty Specs Martirano in North Jersey to carry out his uncle's orders. Orders that basically consisted of making sure that SCARFO's street tax and tribute money were being collected and sent down to Leonetti in Atlantic City for his uncle's safekeeping. I was meeting a couple times a week with Bobby Simone, and Bobby had introduced me to a lawyer friend of his named Oscar Goodman from Las Vegas. Bobby told me, "Oscar's one of the best lawyers in the country. If you get arrested, I want him sitting next to you." I was going to see my uncle once or twice a week in Philadelphia, and I would go and see Faffy when I got done visiting my uncle to pick up our money, or to hear what was going on in Philadelphia. I was basically going through the motions, doing what my uncle wanted, but my heart wasn't in it anymore. I knew it was only a matter of time before it was lights out. In early March, Leonetti and Maria boarded a plane and headed to SCARFO's South Florida estate, Casablanca South, for 2 weeks of rest and relaxation. It was me and Maria, and we had a ball down there. It was the two of us and Spike. Spike and Maria were both amazing cooks, and they would try to outdo one another, but she would always win. We would sit by the pool all day or take the boat out. Those 2 weeks were like being in heaven with everything that was going on. I knew the reality of the situation we were in, but I didn't want to face it. Several weeks later, on April 9th, 1987, Philip Leonetti would be forced to face that reality when he was arrested as he drove from Atlantic City to Philadelphia to meet with Bobby Simone. It was me and Tori Scafidi in the car, and I noticed the whole time we were driving that we were being followed by what seemed like at least 5 cars. I said to Tori, "I think I'm going to be arrested." We drove over the Ben Franklin Bridge and into Center City and headed towards Bobby's office, which was near Rittenhouse Square. When we got to 19th and Walnut, the cops were everywhere. They came from behind us. They came the wrong way down Walnut and got in front of us. They came from the park. They were everywhere. They grabbed me and Tori and handcuffed us and put us in separate cars. Bobby must have seen all of the commotion and came down from his office. And when he came over to the car and I said, "Bobby, what am I being arrested for?" And he said, "The murder of Salvi Testa." Police records show that Leonetti and Scafidi were arrested at 1:40 p.m., and 15 minutes later, at 1:55 p.m., Francis Faffy Iannarella was arrested inside the SCARFO mob's primary clubhouse, a social club at the corner of Camac and Moore in the heart of South Philadelphia, a half-block away from Passyunk Avenue and the candy shop where Salvi Testa was executed. By 6 p.m. that night, Joseph Joe Pungatori, Salvatore Wayne Grand, and his brother Joseph, all former members of Salvi Testa's young executioner's crew, and the 3 principals charged in his murder, were behind bars with Leonetti, Iannarella, and Scafidi. A separate indictment unsealed the next day charged the already jailed Nicodemo Scarfo and the entire hierarchy of his criminal organization with numerous racketeering offenses, including the murder of Judge Edwin Halfant in 1978, the murder of Vincent Falcone in 1979, the murder of John Calabrese in 1981, the murder of Frank Chicky Narducci Sr. in 1982, the murders of Pat Spirito, Sammy Tamburino, and Robert Ricobene in 1983, and finally, the murder of Salvatore Salvi Testa in 1984. Several attempted murders and dozens of other crimes were included in the indictment, which was based primarily on the testimony from cooperating witnesses Tommy Del Giorno, and Nicholas Nick the Crow Caramandi, both of whom had defected from the mob in November 1986. We were all in jail, and none of us got bail. The only guy that they let out on bail was Joe Punch's brother Anthony. The rest of us were locked up in one of two prisons, either Holmesburg or the detention center, both of which were in Philadelphia. I was in Holmesburg with my uncle, Joe Legambi, Lawrence, Joe Punch, Faffy, and a couple other guys. I think Torrey was with us, and the Narducci brothers. My uncle was getting ready to go on trial in the Rouse extortion case, and the rest of us were just getting acclimated to being locked up. Prior to that, none of us had ever been locked up for more than a couple of days, except for my uncle. I remember one day out in the yard we were all together, and my uncle said, "We're going to stick together, and we're going to beat this thing." A few weeks later, on May 6, 1987, a federal jury convicted Nicodemo Little Nicky Scarfo of conspiracy and extortion stemming from his involvement in the attempted extortion of Philadelphia land developer Willard Rouse. On August 4, 1987, Nicky Scarfo was sentenced to 14 years in federal prison following his conviction in the Rouse case. The next thing that happened is that me, my uncle, Chucky, Faffy, Junior Stano, and Charlie White all got hit with an 848 continuing criminal enterprise on the P2P case, which they unsealed when we got locked up. Of all of the cases they tried to bring, this one was the absolute worst. We did a lot of stuff. Murder, loan sharking, extortion, you name it. But we weren't drug dealers. The jury in that case agreed and acquitted Scarfo, Leonetti, Merlino, and Iannarella of all charges. Ralph Jr. Stano and Charlie White Iannici were both fugitives, and at that time, neither had been caught. When the jury found us not guilty, the courtroom went nuts. During the commotion, my uncle walked over to the jury box and shook hands with one of the female jurors, and one of the marshals came over and grabbed him. My uncle said, "I just wanted to shake their hands. Thank God for them. This is the beginning of the end of the lies and those liars." He was talking about Tommy Dell and the Crow. The judge was banging his gavel and saying, "Order, order," and the U.S. Attorney Barry Gross said something under his breath to my uncle, telling him to shut up, and my uncle screamed back, "No, you shut the fuck up." As they were leading us from the courtroom back to jail, my uncle stopped and screamed at the prosecutors, "Who lied? Caramandi and Del Giorno, that's who. Two lying, no-good rats, that's all you got." Then, in the direction of the FBI agents in the room, my uncle said, "And you stay away from our women." You should have seen their faces. They looked like they wanted to cry. Down in the holding cell, we were celebrating, hugging and kissing each other on the cheek. It was the first time in almost 2 years that me and my uncle were together with Chucky, and everything seemed normal between us, like old times. We were all so happy that we beat the case. When we got back to Holmesburg, the whole place went nuts. They had seen that we won on TV. Guys were banging on their doors and cheering, and when we got back to our cell block, which was D block, everyone was lined up waiting for us. Lawrence, Joe Punch, Joe Legambi, Philip and Frankie Narducci. It felt real good to beat the government again. Philip Leonetti, now 34, had been found not guilty in the 1980 trial for murdering Vincent Falcone the year before. And now, in 1987, he was found not guilty in the P2P drug case. As 1987 came to a close, a reporter from the Philadelphia Inquirer, who happened to be taking a tour of Holmesburg for a story he was writing about the prison, was amazed when he saw Nicky Scarfo exiting his cell on D Block. The reporter, John Wustendijk, wrote the following. Wearing a spotless white T-shirt tucked into prison-issued blue pants, his gray hair neatly swooped back from his forehead, inmate 87-00475 walked easily through the open doorway of cell 425 on D Block at Holmesburg Prison. The story goes on to say that Scarfo appeared relatively comfortable, at ease among friends in Philadelphia's toughest and most run-down prison, and quoted prison officials who said that Scarfo was courteous and polite to correctional officers, and spent a lot of time reading the newspapers, exercising, and working on his legal case, never straying too far from his inmate bodyguards. For the most part, we didn't bother anyone, and nobody bothered us. One time, I got into an argument with an inmate, a big black guy. They said he was a drug kingpin or something. He had a big mouth on him, and he was always breaking somebody's balls, usually the younger, smaller black guys. One day I told him to knock it off, and he didn't like being challenged. One thing led to another, and we had a little altercation, and the guards broke us up before it got serious. As a result of the altercation, Leonetti got 5 days in solitary confinement, locked in an 8-by-10-foot concrete cell for 24 hours a day, and the prisoner was immediately transferred to another prison amidst internal reports that Leonetti planned to kill the big black guy over the incident. We never saw him again, and the other kids that I stood up for were so happy that he got transferred that when I came out of the hole after doing the 5 days, they were cheering for me. SCARFO, Leonetti, and the rest of their gang would sit behind bars as 1987 turned to 1988, awaiting the Salvi Testa murder trial, which was scheduled for April, and for the massive RICO trial, which was set for September. With all of us locked up, most of what was going on outside, the street tax and the rest of the stuff we were involved in, had all but dried up. My uncle put his cousin Anthony Piccolo, who he made the consigliere right before he went to jail, in charge out on the street. He was now the street boss. It was him and Nicky Jr. who would collect the money and keep things in order. Nicky Jr. would come and see me or my uncle once or twice a week and let us know what was going on and who was paying and who wasn't paying and who was playing games. We'd send messages through him to guys on the street, but our main focus was meeting with the lawyers and fighting the cases. As the Testa murder trial began in Philadelphia Common Pleas Court, Leonetti felt confident in facing Caramandi and Del Giorno, having just prevailed several months prior in the P2P case. It was me, my uncle, Chucky, Faffy, Joe Punch, Torrey, Wayne Grand, Joe Grant, and Charlie White that were on trial. Bobby Simone represented my uncle. I had Oscar Goodman, and Chucky had Ed Jacobs. I'll never forget how Bobby told the jury in his opening statement that "You will never hear testimony from people more corrupt and disgusting," meaning the Crow and Tommy Dell. Apparently, the jury agreed with Simone, and on May 10, 1988, after deliberating for only 6 hours, the jury found SCARFO, Leonetti, and the 7 others not guilty of murdering Salvi Testa. A few days after we beat the Testa case, I was out in the yard playing basketball, and my uncle comes over and motions for me to come over to where he was standing. He says, "I talked to Bobby, and he thinks there is a good chance that you can make bail and get out of here." So I said, "Wow, that's great news." My uncle's wife had gambled away a lot of money in the casinos, and when my uncle found out about it, he went nuts. He said, "Just make sure Nicky Jr. doesn't know it was us." This is how evil he was. He wanted me to be the mother of his children, which I never would have done in a million years. He hated her. He only called her that motherfucker. That's the only way I ever remember him referring to her. My uncle also wanted me to kill both Joey and Wayne Grand if they made bail, because he heard that they had gotten one of my cousins involved in dealing drugs. My uncle said if you find out it's true, both of them get this, and he made the sign of the gun. A few weeks later, Leonetti's application for bail was denied. You have to understand, I was charged in the Pepe Leva murder, and that case got dismissed. I was found not guilty in the Falcone murder, not guilty in the P2P case, and not guilty in the Testa murder. I was 4 for 4. I knew Bobby and the other lawyers had Tommy Dell and the Crow's number down pat, and I was very confident going into the RICO case. Then, those guys won their RICO in North Jersey, and I started thinking, I'm getting the fuck out of here. I thought I had the government on the run. The guys in North Jersey were 20 mobsters associated with Anthony Tumac Achaturo and the New Jersey faction of the Lucchese crime family that he controlled. They had recently been found not guilty of all charges in a massive federal case that had lasted more than 21 months. I figured if those guys could win, we could win. All of us felt confident going into the RICO case because 2 different juries had rejected the testimony of Del Giorno and Caramandi. This was it. This was the big one. If I won this, I was home free. My uncle had to do the 14 years on the Rouse case, and him, Chucky, the Narduccis, Faffi, Lawrence, the Milanos, and Joe Ligambi still had to go to trial for the Flowers murder, but I wasn't in that one, so this was it for me. The stage was set for jury selection on September 10, 1988, in United States v. Nicodemo D. Scarfo, Philip M. Leonetti, et al. This was for all the marbles. The government's team was led by veteran prosecutors Louis Piccini, Arnold Gordon, Joel Friedman, David Fritchie, Albert Wicks, and Joseph Peters, who were armed with a massive indictment that charged Scarfo, Leonetti, and 15 others with participating in 14 murders and attempted murders and a slew of other RICO predicate offenses, including extortion, loan sharking, bookmarking, and the distribution of P2P. The indictment charged the hierarchy of the crime family as follows. Nicodemo Little Nicky Scarfo, age 59, as being the boss of the crime family. Philip Crazy Phil Leonetti, age 35, as being the underboss of the crime family. Francis Faffi Iannarella, age 41, as being a caporegime, street boss of the crime family. Joseph Chicky Ciancalini, age 53, as being a caporegime in the crime family. Joseph Joe Punge Pungitori, age 32, as being a soldier in the crime family. Nicholas Nick the Blade Virgilio, age 61, as being a soldier in the crime family. Salvatore Chucky Merlino, age 49, as being the one-time underboss and later a soldier in the crime family. Lawrence Yogi Merlino, age 42, as being a former caporegime and later a soldier in the crime family. Charles Charlie White Iannici, age 53, as being a soldier in the crime family. Salvatore Wayne Grand, age 35, as being a soldier in the crime family. Joseph Joey Grand, age 28, as being a soldier in the crime family. Frankie Narducci, age 35, as being a soldier in the crime family. Philip Narducci, age 27, as being a soldier in the crime family. Salvatore Tori Scafidi, age 27, as being a soldier in the crime family. Eugene Gino Milano, age 29, as being a soldier in the crime family. Ralph Jr. Staino, age 56, as being a soldier in the crime family. Anthony Tony Pungitori, age 35, as being a soldier in the crime family. In their opening statement, the government promised to give the jurors a window into the world of La Cosa Nostra, focusing on crimes committed between 1976 and 1987, the heyday of Nicodemo Little Nicky Scarfo and his nephew Philip Crazy Phil Leonetti. The trial started at the end of September after a few weeks of jury selection and went all the way through October and into November. Every day was the same routine. They would wake us up around 5 a.m. and transport us to court in a bus with tinted windows. We would be handcuffed and shackled on the bus, and they would lead us into the courthouse to a basement holding cell, where we would get dressed and would be in the courtroom by 9 a.m. The trial was basically Tommy Dell and the Crow, and a bunch of FBI agents and cops who had followed us for years. They had some audio tapes and a ton of pictures. They even brought Joe Salerno in to testify against us, and they had a bunch of bookmakers and drug dealers we had shaken down. The further the trial went, the more it became apparent that we were literally fighting for our lives, and that the government was playing for keeps. They wanted us real bad. By the end of October, I think we were all worn down. We'd have some good days here and there, and then we would have some really bad days. The trial was definitely taking its toll on all of us. What would happen next would bring Philip Leonetti to tears and further demonstrate the evil nature of his uncle Nicodemo Little Nicky Scarfo. So one day, while the Crow was on the stand, we took our regular afternoon break. We would all go back into a holding pen, and there were these little conference rooms where we could meet with the lawyers when they came back. So Bobby comes back and calls me and my uncle into one of the conference rooms and says, "I got some bad news. and you could just tell by looking at Bobby that it was bad. It was written all over his face. Then Bobby says, "Nick, you're going to want to sit down for this one." And my uncle said, "What is it, Bob?" And Bobby said, "Mark tried to kill himself this morning. They found him hanging in the bathroom of SCARFO Inc. They flew him from Atlantic City to Philadelphia on a helicopter, and he is in ICU at Hahnemann Hospital. It doesn't look good." I remember welling up with tears and feeling nauseous, like I was going to throw up. This kid was 17 years old and was a beautiful kid, well-behaved, good-looking, always respectful. He was my uncle's youngest son, his baby. And as Bobby's telling us this, Bobby's choked up. I've got tears in my eyes. And my uncle, this no-good, evil motherfucker, has absolutely no reaction, no emotion, nothing. He's just standing there, and he doesn't say a word. A few minutes later, the judge brings us all back into court and announces that court is in recess for the day. You could see all the lawyers whispering to their clients, telling them what happened, and every one of them had the same reaction. They looked sick about it. Even the judge and the prosecutors, who hated my uncle, looked sick. How could you not be when a 17-year-old kid tries to kill himself? But my uncle, this cocksucker, he never flinched, never batted an eye. So now we are all going back down to the holding pen in the basement and waiting for the bus to take us back to Holmesburg. No one is saying a word. Every day after court when we're heading back, we'd always be breaking balls. You got to remember, there was 17 of us, and we're all looking at spending the rest of our lives in prison, so we had to do something to lighten the mood. But on this day, no one said nothing. It was dead fucking silence. And then, when we all got into the holding pen and sat on the benches waiting for the bus to come, out of nowhere, my uncle went nuts, and he exploded on me. His eyes got real big, and he was pointing at me and saying, "You know, I blame this on you and your mother, the way she would scream and holler at Mark, and that vein would come out of her throat. This is your fault, you and that witch sister of mine. You're just like her." And then he mumbled something to himself in Italian. While this was going on, all the guys we were on trial with were all sitting on the benches that were up against the wall, staring straight at the floor. None of them made eye contact with either one of us, and none of them said a word. Here I am sitting there, absolutely disgusted. Not only was I disgusted over what had happened with Mark, I was also disgusted with myself. I'm 35 years old, and I'm sitting in this holding cell, handcuffed and shackled, and I'm looking at spending the rest of my life in jail. I dedicated every waking moment of my adult life to my uncle and La Cosa Nostra, and this no-good evil motherfucker is going to sit there and blame me for his son trying to... But the thing with me, the thing that always made me smarter than him, is the fact that no one, including him, ever knew what I was thinking or what I was feeling. I could read him like a book. I always knew what he was going to do before he even thought about doing it. He was predictable. Mentally, he played checkers with me, where I played chess with him. At that moment, sitting in that cell listening to him blame me for Mark, I don't know if I have ever felt such a combination of raw emotion and such rage, both at the same time. I'm not the kind of guy who's going to get into a screaming match with anyone, let alone in front of 15 other guys, and let my opponent or adversary know what I was thinking. And at that very moment, he was no longer my uncle. He was no longer my boss. He was my adversary, my enemy. I made up my mind right there in that split second that my life was going to go one of two ways. Number one, if I won the RICO case, I was going to take Maria, little Philip, and my mother, and we were out of here. No more Atlantic City, no more Philadelphia, no more mob, no more of my uncle. I was done with it all. Number two, if I lost the RICO case, I was going to cooperate with the feds. Even if they still gave me 100 years, I didn't care. This was about breaking with my uncle and La Cosa Nostra. It wasn't about jail time. The time didn't matter to me. It never did. If I never saw the light of day, so be it. But I was going to live the rest of my days for me, for Maria, for my son, for my mother. Not for my fucking uncle, and not for his La Cosa Nostra. As the RICO trial continued, with the unrelenting onslaught from the federal prosecutors and the overwhelming depth of the government's case, Leonetti knew that his chances for an acquittal were slim at best. On November 19, 1988, after 2 full days of deliberation, the jury convicted Nicodemos Scarfo, Philip Leonetti, and all 15 co-defendants of every charge in the indictment. In the end, there was too much for us to overcome. All the killings, all the violence, all the treachery. It was almost like we had made it easy for them to convict us. How could they not, with everything they heard? I know this sounds crazy, but when they found us guilty, I felt a huge sense of relief. I knew we were finished, and I knew that this life, La Cosa Nostra, was over for me. Nicky Scarfo, Jr., who was running the day-to-day operation of the now decimated crime family, with Anthony Cousin Tony Piccolo, Scarfo Sr.'s first cousin, came to visit both Scarfo and Leonetti behind bars a few days after the verdict. Nicky Jr. comes in, and he's telling me and my uncle what is going on out in the street. He says nobody's paying, there's no structure anymore. It's every man for himself. He says, I went and saw Bobby the other day, and I told him what was going on, and my uncle says, what did he say? And Nicky says, he said it was over, and that you have no shot on appeal. My uncle said, nothing is over as long as we're still breathing, and he points to me and him. You tell that to Bobby and anyone else who thinks it's over. As long as we're around, it ain't ever over. And Nicky Jr. just nodded. I said, how's Mark doing? And Nicky Jr. said, he's still in a coma, but the doctors say he's going to make it, and that maybe we can bring him home at some point. My uncle says, I can't have him back to Georgia Avenue after what he's done. I got up and left the visit without saying another word. I went back to the cell block, and I picked up the phone, and I called the FBI. Philip Leonetti, who as a teenager served as a mob messenger taking messages from his imprisoned uncle and the family's boss, Angelo Bruno, to their soldiers on the street, became a mob associate in his early 20s, a mob killer at 23, a made man at 27, a capo regime at 28, an underboss at 33, and an acting boss at 34, had now taken steps, at the age of 35, to do the unthinkable, become an informant and cooperate with the government. By January 1984, Nicky Scarfo had been the boss of the Philadelphia Atlantic City mob for approximately 34 months, and spent 17 of those months, or half of his tenure to that point, behind bars in a federal prison in El Paso, Texas. The crime family he had left was not necessarily the crime family he was returning to at the end of his prison sentence. Simply put, the Scarfo mob was in tatters, with many of Scarfo's top guys facing legal problems of their own, some of the charges stemming from incidents that occurred while Scarfo's men were drunk. For starters, Scarfo's longtime friend and underboss, Salvatore Chucky Merlino, had been arrested on suspicion of drunk driving in Margate, and during the course of his arrest, the drunken mob underboss had offered the arresting officer a bribe in the form of his expensive gold watch, as the entire episode was captured on videotape. Merlino was booked on attempted bribery and DWI charges, and faced as many as 10 years in state prison. Merlino's brother Lawrence had been arrested and charged with disorderly conduct after he got drunk at a wedding and then made terroristic threats to a Philadelphia police officer. Like his brother Chucky, Lawrence was also facing state prison time. Despite promising to clean up his act, Nicholas Nick the Blade Virgilio was back in trouble after a drunken incident at an Atlantic City casino, where during a fight, he threatened to kill a man. The twice-convicted murderer was sent to state prison for 3 years as a result. Scarfo's own son, Nicky Jr., was facing an underage drinking rap following an arrest in Atlantic City. Scarfo capo Joseph Chicky Ciancalini had lost his appeal on federal racketeering charges and was hauled off to federal prison, as was his co-defendant, Mario Sonny Ricobene, who headed what was left of the Ricobene gang. Both Raymond Long John Martirano and his son Cowboy were facing federal drug charges, and rumors were around that Long John would soon face charges for his role in the murder of union boss John McCullough, after it was reported that the triggerman Willard Jr. Moran was cooperating with the Philadelphia District Attorney's Office. Saul Kane was also under investigation on federal drug charges. Frank Geraci was facing charges that he had embezzled union funds when he was the head of Local 54 and allegedly funneled those funds to Scarfo and Leonetti. Even Scarfo's attorney Bobby Simone was facing a federal prison sentence after getting indicted for income tax evasion. But the worst news Scarfo was to hear dealt with his own nephew, Philip Leonetti, who had been indicted on extortion charges stemming from his involvement in a corrupt land deal with the mayor of Atlantic City. Now, while all of the stuff with the Ricobenes was going on in Philadelphia, I started getting involved with some new things for our family in Atlantic City. A few years earlier, I had been approached by a guy named Frank Lentino, who had been a Teamster, and then was with us in Local 54, about getting involved with a local politician named Mike Matthews, who wanted to become the mayor of Atlantic City. Mike Matthews sent word through Frank Lentino that he wanted our help in getting him elected. We had given him almost $200,000 for his campaign and had helped him win by getting all of the unions to support him. One of the first things he did for me was to make a guy who we were close with the chief of police. His name was Joe Pasquale, and he and my uncle both knew him and liked him. We trusted him, and he always looked out for us. Now, when I was meeting with Mike Matthews, one of the trade-offs for our support was that we would get a piece of what they called the H-Tract, which was a 78-acre parcel of land that the city was going to sell to a casino developer for millions of dollars. It had been a landfill, the site of the city dump, but this was going to be a major score for all of us, me and my uncle, as well as Matthews and Frank Lentino, who had set the whole thing up. Everything seemed great. But it wasn't. The casino developer who had promised to pay Matthews and Lentino the kickback money that would be used to pay Scarfo and Leonetti turned out to be an undercover FBI agent. Before long, Leonetti, Lentino, and Matthews were all indicted and looking at lengthy federal prison sentences. Nicodemo Scarfo would be named as an unindicted co-conspirator. It seemed that the only high-ranking member of the Scarfo mob that didn't have legal problems was Salvi Testa, Scarfo's street boss and the leader of the young executioner's crew. But Salvi Testa had other problems. Following the shooting incident in the Italian market, the handsome young mob captain started dating the beautiful, dark-haired daughter of family underboss Salvatore Chucky Merlino. Pretty soon, the two lovebirds were engaged, and a wedding date was set. The underworld was abuzz at the thought of the Merlino and Testa families, both mob royalty, being aligned through marriage. Everyone seemed to be happy for them. Well, almost everybody. One day my uncle called the office from jail, and I told him that Salvi had gotten engaged to Chucky's daughter. When I said it, there was dead silence on his end of the receiver. I knew that he wasn't happy about it. I knew that his paranoia would start, and he would go through every possible scenario of what could happen if Salvi married Chucky's daughter. Would they form an alliance and try to overthrow him? Would they try to kill him? Could he ever fully trust that they weren't plotting against him? These are all of the thoughts that went through his head in the 15 seconds of silence on the phone. That is how his sick mind worked. But Scarfo's worries were for naught, as Salvi Testa would soon break off the engagement, leaving both Chucky Merlino and his daughter embarrassed and furious. The once solid relationship between Nicky Scarfo's underboss and his street boss was now irrevocably shattered, and little Nicky couldn't have been happier. My uncle was set to be released from prison right around New Year's Day in 1984, but the feds didn't let him out. Bobby Simone and Nicky Jr. flew down to Texas to see what the issue was. After a few days, Bobby sorted everything out, and my uncle's release was back on and scheduled for January 20th. A bunch of us flew down to El Paso to be there when he got out. It was me, Chucky, Lawrence, Salvi, Bobby Simone, Nicky Jr., Harold Garber, Chucky's son Joey, Tori Scafidi, and a few others. We took several suites at the Marriott, and we had one giant party in that hotel. We must have spent 20 grand on food and liquor that weekend. I remember having mixed feelings about my uncle coming home. I knew it meant that my life was going back to the way it was before he went to jail, running around all day, all of the chaos. But that was the life I had chosen, or I guess had been chosen for me. I didn't have the option of saying, hey, I want to go to college, or I want to be a doctor. This was the path that I was put on as a young boy. There was no way to change that. I was born and raised in this thing, in La Cosa Nostra. So the day he gets out of jail, we take a limousine to the prison. It was me, Lawrence, Nicky Jr., and Bobby Simone. My uncle comes out, and he's wearing a red windbreaker and a pair of sunglasses, and he has a box containing his belongings. The first thing he says is, let's get the fuck out of here. And we start heading towards the car. The news media, the FBI, and even the Texas Rangers were there, and everyone was taking pictures. Not the baseball team, the cops. They were wearing the 10-gallon hats and had the stars on their chest, the whole 9 yards. As we're walking, my uncle nods in their direction and says, get a load of these jerk-offs in the cowboy hats. I knew from my uncle's demeanor that he had not changed one bit during his 17 months in El Paso. He looked very fit and had a deep tan. Back at the hotel, everyone made a big deal when he got there, and we had a good time. He seemed like he was in a good mood. He pulled me aside at one point and asked me about the money I had collected while he was away. I told him it was just under $3 million, and he was happy. He then pulled me away even further and said, what's going on with Salvi and Chucky? I told him Chucky wasn't happy that Salvi broke off the engagement, but that Chucky hadn't said too much about it. He said, we got to keep our antennas up on this one. I don't like this situation. I knew right there that my uncle was spooked about the possibility of Salvi marrying Chucky's daughter, and then with the engagement being broken off, it seemed like he was even more spooked. I can't explain it, but he was always thinking like that. Nothing was simple. Everything had a subplot, and the subplots had subplots. It would make you dizzy listening to him. Meanwhile, 10 feet away, Chucky Merlino, Salvi Testa, and the rest of those gathered to celebrate Nicky Scarfo's release from prison were having a great time and oblivious to what was going on in Scarfo's head. To the others, this was just a party, but with Nicky Scarfo, nothing was ever what it seemed. It was a scene fit for a king. News cameras were everywhere. Photographers snapped shots of his every move. Nicodemos Scarfo's long-awaited homecoming at the Philadelphia International Airport caused the level of commotion usually reserved for the arrival of a head of state or an A-list celebrity. And in a lot of ways it was appropriate. Scarfo had become both. He was the undisputed head of the Philadelphia Atlantic City La Cosa Nostra, and his notoriety had made him one of the nation's foremost celebrity gangsters. Always impeccably dressed and groomed, the 55-year-old Scarfo had become a media sensation, a precursor to the flamboyant John Gotti, who was then still a lowly soldier in New York's Gambino family. As the cameras flashed and reporters followed his entourage, little Nicky was carrying himself with a swashbuckling swagger and regal flair not typical of someone who had just been released from prison. I think, in many ways, my uncle had become even more self-centered and more self-absorbed during the 17 months that he was away. His ego was 1,000 times worse than it was before. Flanking Scarfo as he walked from the airport terminal to a waiting fleet of white limousines were his top 2 lieutenants, Philip Leonetti, who was 30 years old, and Salvatore Testa, who was 27. When Scarfo was away in El Paso, Leonetti and Testa worked together to look after his empire with ruthless efficiency, proving their merit as future leaders in La Cosa Nostra and as possible heirs to Scarfo's throne. But therein was a problem. Beneath the surface and all of the smiles, backslaps, and kisses on the cheek, SCARFO was an evil and vindictive despot who maintained an unquenchable thirst for blood as a means of both obtaining and keeping power. While SCARFO loved every minute of it, Leonetti was growing tired of it. There was a time in my life when all I wanted was to be with my uncle and to be with La Cosa Nostra and live that life 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, just like my uncle. It's all that I knew. But when he went away, and I started living my own life, waking up every day and making my own decisions, I started to resent both my uncle and what being involved in La Cosa Nostra was doing to my life. I felt like I had no life being in the mob, no identity. I realized that I was a lot happier doing things with Maria or doing things with Philip Jr. than I was doing things with my uncle. But I was trapped. Once you are in this life, there's only two ways out: jail or death. There was no retiring or quitting. I felt stuck. And then there was the pure sport of it. La Cosa Nostra was my uncle's whole life. He lived for this thing. Every day was just like the day before it. Where are we getting money? How much are we getting? Who's making what moves? Who do we have to watch? Who do we have to kill? That was our routine, day after day after day. If you made a big score and made him a lot of money, the second he was done counting the money, he would say to me, "This guy thinks he's a big shot now. All of a sudden he's J.D. Rockefeller." Or, "We gotta watch him so he doesn't get too big for his britches." The guy just hands you a bag with $200,000 in it, and 10 minutes later, you're burying the guy. It didn't make sense, but that's how he was. If he ordered you to kill someone, and you did it perfectly, and you got the guy just like he asked, he'd say to me, "Now this guy thinks he's Al Capone because he killed the guy." As quickly as he would build somebody up, he'd already be bringing them down. Nowhere would this be more evident than with the next mobster who found himself in Nicky SCARFO's crosshairs. So when we get back to Atlantic City, my uncle stayed in for a day or two, just to get his bearings straight. On the third or fourth day, he had me set up a full day of meetings at Scanicchio's, so he could talk to everyone and see what was going on. He told me to bring down Chucky and Bobby Simone, and he wanted to see Blackie Napoli from North Jersey. He was going to meet with everyone separately, and he wanted an hour or two blocked out for each meeting. I said, "Do you want me to bring Salvi down?" And he said, "I don't think we need to." Now this gets my antenna up, because the whole time my uncle is gone, it was mainly Salvi and his guys who were out there shooting it out with the Rico Benes, and Salvi was also heavily involved in the street tax collections. I found it strange that my uncle wasn't bringing him down to meet with him too. He tells me, "I want you in on these meetings," which means I gotta sit there all day. The first guy down was Blackie Napoli. When my uncle was away, I was meeting with Blackie once or twice a month, and he was bringing my uncle's tribute money down. Now Blackie was getting up there in age, and he wasn't as sharp as he used to be, but him and my uncle went way back, even before they were in Yardville together. My uncle wastes no time in telling him, "These envelopes you sent down while I was away, they were light. What are you guys doing up there? Did you forget how to make money, or are you guys just giving it away?" When my uncle became boss, remember, it was him and Blackie who first went to see Bobby Manor the day after Phil Testa's wake. My uncle always knew that Blackie was letting Bobby Manor and the Genovese take more than they should in North Jersey, but my uncle felt like Blackie had given away the store up there when he was in jail. Then my uncle told Blackie, "We're going to tighten our belts up there. No more free lunches for anyone. I don't care who they're with." And Blackie left. I could tell he was disappointed, because he thought he had done a good job while my uncle was gone. When he left, my uncle said, "I'm taking him down. He's getting too old. He's losing his fastball. I'm going to keep him up there, but I'm putting Patty Specs in charge up there. Bring him down tomorrow and tell him I want to see him." Patty Specs was a guy named Pasquale Martirano, who had been with the North Jersey branch of our family dating back to the days when Ange was boss. The next one in was Bobby Simone. My uncle seemed very concerned about Bobby's tax case, and Bobby talked about it a little bit. My uncle then went through the litany of criminal charges that everyone in the family was facing, from Chucky's bribery case to my thing with the mayor, and asked Bobby to explain every possible scenario of everyone's individual cases. This went on for like 2 hours. My uncle was just asking hypotheticals. Towards the end, he said, "I can't depend on anybody in this entire Borgata. Everybody's drunk, stupid, or incompetent. I should go get 6 black guys from North Philly and start a new gang. They'd be better than what I got right now." Now, I can't say anything, but what I'm thinking is, you just came home from jail, you got $3 million sitting in a safe, everybody you wanted us to kill is dead, and you're still complaining? So after Bobby leaves, Chucky comes in. Chucky's telling him everything that had been going on in Philly while he was away. He says to my uncle, "We never filled Frank's spot after he got killed," meaning the consigliere position. "And with Ciancalini in jail, we are down a capo." My uncle says, "I'm going to put my Uncle Nick in as consigliere," meaning his mother's brother, Nicky Buck Piccolo. Now, me and Chucky both know how bad my uncle hates his Uncle Nick. He hated him and his brothers his whole life. He used to say they were no good, that they mistreated him, and always tried to hold him back. Now he's going to make him the consigliere. The position of consigliere is very important in La Cosa Nostra. The consigliere is the counselor, someone to settle disputes in the family, and someone who can advise the boss. The consig is the third most powerful position in the family, behind the boss and underboss. Bobby Manna was the chin's consigliere, and Bobby was the chin's eyes and ears. My uncle is going to make his uncle the consigliere, a guy he hated his whole life. It didn't make any sense. It's almost like he was saying, "I don't need a consigliere, 'cause I ain't asking nobody their opinion or how to settle disputes." My uncle settled almost every dispute with a gun, but that wasn't what La Cosa Nostra was about. When my uncle got out of La Tuna, this thing started to become my thing with him. Then he says, "And as for Chicky's crew, let's leave things the way they are for now. Too many chiefs and not enough Indians," which was his way of saying he wanted more soldiers and less captains. He wanted to keep all the power for himself. Then he says to Chucky, "What about Salvi?" It was like he said it in slow motion, like a movie. I couldn't believe it. I immediately felt sick. I knew at that very second that my uncle had decided that he was going to turn on Salvi and was now going to make a case for killing him. Leonetti's intuitions would prove to be spot on. Only days out of jail, Nicky Scarfo was already plotting his next kill. And this time, instead of Salvi Testa doing the killing, he would be the one getting killed. Prior to this, Philip Leonetti had been Nicky Scarfo's prized pupil and had never seriously questioned his uncle's leadership. He was, in many respects, the perfect soldier, the perfect protege. But by putting a hit out on Salvi Testa, little Nicky had gone too far, even for Crazy Phil. Nicky Scarfo's increasingly erratic behavior had shaken Philip's faith in his uncle and his blind allegiance to La Cosa Nostra to the core, turning his world upside down. For the first time in his life, Philip was seriously reconsidering his path in life. Being his uncle's protege had worn him down, both physically and emotionally, and he didn't know how much more he could take. My uncle went crazy with the power when he became the boss. It was like he got drunk off of it. He became so full of jealousy and hatred that he had turned into something out of a horror movie. This wasn't a thing of honor or respect anymore. It wasn't even about the money. It was all about the power. Bodies were falling everywhere. He wanted to murder everyone and everything around him. It wasn't enough for us to kill our enemies. We were now going to start killing our friends. He used to say, "The only way to hold on to the power is to kill anyone who stands in your way." That's the kind of mentality he had on everything. He was just looking for excuses to kill guys. And the more power he got, the crazier and more paranoid he became. My mother used to call him Adolf behind his back. That's how bad it was. He would get angry and tell a whole group of guys, "Don't fucking test me, 'cause I'll bring in a squad of guys from New York and wipe everybody in this room right off the fucking map. I won't leave none of you guys standing." He's talking about killing our whole family. And these guys knew he'd do it. And guess what? He would have. I didn't understand it. Before, we were only killing bad people. Now, we're killing everybody. It didn't make sense. Now we're going to kill Salvi? He was one of us. He loved my uncle. He believed in this thing, La Cosa Nostra. He killed for it, and he almost died for it. Salvi looked up to my uncle as almost a second father. Right before Phil Testa died, we were having dinner, and he turned to my uncle. I'll never forget it. He said, "Nick, if God forbid something were to happen to me, please be sure and always take care of Salvi." And my uncle said, "God forbid that would happen. I would treat him as one of my own." That kept replaying over and over in my head when he said that he would treat Salvi as one of his own. And now he's going to have him killed. Who was going to be next? Me? Several factors contributed to the animosity that Nicky Scarfo felt towards Salvi Testa in those early months of 1984. Salvi Testa had ruffled Scarfo's feathers when he became engaged to Chucky Merlino's daughter. Despite the fact that both Testa and Merlino were like family to him, the increasingly paranoid mob dictator saw it as a power play by either Testa or Merlino, or perhaps both, and became obsessed with stopping the marriage. Salvi Testa's stock had been on the rise in the underworld since he personally avenged the death of his father by murdering two of the men responsible in such sensational fashion. Testa was, in a lot of ways, like a younger version of Scarfo himself. He had developed a loyal crew of killers with the young executioners, and he enjoyed an almost rabid rock star-type following among many in the Philly underworld. All of this made Scarfo see Testa as a potential threat to his power, and this paranoia would ultimately lead to Testa's brutal downfall. The tipping point in Scarfo's betrayal of Salvi Testa came in April 1984, after an article in the Wall Street Journal referred to the ruggedly handsome and charismatic Testa as the fastest rising mobster in the United States. When Testa got cold feet and broke off the engagement to Merlino's daughter, the always plotting Scarfo saw an opportunity to manipulate the situation and turn his inner circle, and ultimately the rest of the family, against Testa for disrespecting the daughter of the underboss. Both Chucky and Salvi loved my uncle. They were both loyal. They would have never gone against him, but he had it in his head that Salvi marrying Chucky's daughter meant they were teaming up to eventually challenge him. So when things started to go south with Salvi and Chucky's daughter, my uncle used it to play both sides against each other and turn Chucky against Salvi, which he can then use to get Chucky to back his plan and help him kill Salvi. What a lot of people didn't know was that right before Salvi broke off the engagement, Salvi talked to my uncle on the phone when he was in prison, and he basically asked my uncle for permission to end it with Chucky's daughter. Salvi was trying to do the right thing. He wasn't trying to disrespect Chucky or his daughter. They were both young. It didn't work out. That's all it was. Now my uncle's telling him from jail, "You don't gotta marry her. You should do what you want. Spread yourself around. Don't worry, when I come home, I'll talk to Chucky. He'll understand." At the same time, he's in Chucky's ear, telling him what Salvi was doing had dishonored his daughter, was a slap in his face, and that he shouldn't stand for that kind of disrespect to his daughter and his family. This cocksucker was stirring the pot. He wanted Salvi to think he was okay with it. Meanwhile, he was getting Chucky all worked up about it. My uncle started to say things about Salvi like, "This kid is getting too big for his britches," or "This kid's acting like he wants to be the boss. We'll see about that." Or he would say, "This kid is full of treason," or "This kid's fooling with drugs," or "These ciggies are always up to something." And all of it was nonsense. I remember that whole summer Salvi was on edge. He knew that something was up. He just didn't know what it was. And here I am, one of his best friends, and there was nothing I could do to help him. I wish I could have saved him, but I couldn't. By the summer of 1984, Nicky Scarfo's plan had worked. Not only was Chucky Merlino backing his play, he was supervising the plot. At one point, Nicky Crow and Charlie White had the contract, but they couldn't get it done. Then Faffy and Tommy Del Giorno had it, but they couldn't get it done either. Salvi's antenna was up, and even though he was a lot younger than all of those guys, he knew the street 100 times better. He wasn't going to be an easy mark. Killing the leader of the young executioner's crew wouldn't be easy. Attempted hits were set up to kill Testa at various locations, including a South Philadelphia health club where he worked out, a beauty salon he owned, mobster Faffy Iannarella's house where a baby shower had been scheduled, a mob gathering at Tommy Del Giorno's condominium on the Ocean City boardwalk, aboard Salvi's boat, which was docked in Ventnor, and an exit ramp in Northfield coming off of the Garden State Parkway. But all of the plans failed. The setting of the next plot to kill Salvi Testa showed just how far the SCARFO mob had deteriorated. Joe Punge was Salvi's best friend. Joe Punge had a brother, Anthony, who was with us. They were part of Salvi's crew. Their father, Old Man Pungitori, who we called the Blonde Babe, was a made guy and had been around since Ange was boss. The Blonde Babe's sister died, Joe Punge's aunt, and the whole family was going to the wake, which was in South Philadelphia, to pay their respects. My uncle was very big on this. Nobody ever missed a wake. Chucky had gotten involved in the planning of Salvi's murder and decided he wanted to bang him right there in the funeral parlor at the wake, and then he wanted Tori Scafidi, who hung around his son Joey, to do the shooting. And guess what? My uncle loves the idea. This is how crazy we had gotten. We're going to shoot a guy inside a funeral parlor during a wake for an old lady. Are you kidding me? That's honorable? That's respectful? So what happens is the night before Tori got into a fight at a bar, and he got pinched. When my uncle finds out about it, he went nuts. He said, "These fucking kids, you can't count on them for nothing." But, as in the Hollywood gangster film life that life in the SCARFO mob had come to resemble, the show must go on. So Chucky assigns the killing to Charlie White, and he tells Charlie White to bring a .38 to the funeral parlor, which he did. The plan was to shoot Salvi inside the bar area. This funeral parlor had a little lounge, and there was a small bar that was separate from the room where the body was. But when we were there, the place was packed. You couldn't even move. We were all at the bar. Me, my uncle, Chucky, Lawrence. Salvi was 10 feet away from us. My uncle told Chucky, "Call it off. This place is no good." And Chucky made eye contact with Charlie White, who was across the room waiting for the signal. And Chucky shook his head no, and Charlie White just disappeared into the crowd. So now it's time to leave, and they have a receiving line outside for the Pungitori family, and we all go through it together, one at a time, the whole mob. As we are going through the line, the guys are gathering near our car so that they can greet my uncle and Chucky, the boss and the underboss, as a sign of respect. Me, my uncle, Chucky, and Lawrence were the last 4 guys in the line. It was Lawrence, Chucky, then my uncle, then me. I was always in front of, next to, or behind my uncle. We never deviated from that. I was his eyes, making sure no one was sneaking up on him. So we are going through the line of our guys, and everyone is there lined up, the whole mob. Faffy, Tommy Dell, the Narducci brothers, Nicky Crow, Charlie White, the Milano brothers, the Grand brothers, Joe Lagambi. Even the Pungitoris left their receiving line to come over and pay their respects. All the other guys were there, and all the way at the end of this line was Salvi. He was standing right next to the limousine we drove up in. So we are going through the line, and we are hugging and kissing everyone, and we are now coming up to Salvi. And when Chucky goes in to kiss him, he grabs both of Salvi's cheeks and kisses him square on the lips for like 10 seconds, and then pulls away and is looking at him with a crazy look in his eye. Salvi looked stunned, and all the guys around, their mouths were hanging wide open. It was the kiss of death. Salvi knew after that my uncle was going to kill him. There was no more doubt about it. SCARFO decided it was time to up the ante, and he called for another meeting with Tommy Del Giorno to discuss a revised plan to murder Salvi Testa. My uncle tells Tommy, "Give the order to Joe Punge." Now, Joe Punge was Salvi's best friend. He was his right-hand man. They were together every day since they were kids. The whole time this is going on, nobody in Salvi's crew knew we were going to kill him. They knew there was some tension, but no one knew exactly what was going on. A few days later, Tommy Dell comes back and he says to my uncle, "Joe Punge said he'd do it, but he doesn't want to pull the trigger." My uncle laughed and said, "What's the fucking difference?" The plot to murder Salvi Testa had become more sinister by enlisting Joseph Joe Punge Pungitori, Testa's best friend, to lure him into what was to be a death trap. Joe Punge knows the rules. If he tells Salvi, or he drags his feet, my uncle will kill him, his brother, and his father, because they are all connected to La Cosa Nostra. Pungitori enlisted 2 other members of the young executioner's crew to carry out the killing of their friend and leader. Joe Punge brought Wayne and Joey Grand in on the plot, and he set up a meeting at a candy store on Passyunk Avenue in South Philly. And when he and Salvi arrived, Wayne pulled out a gun and shot Salvi in the back of his head. I heard that Wayne then stood over him and shot him again to make sure he was dead. He was. Hours later, another crew of bloodthirsty SCARFO mobsters would go to the candy shop and retrieve Testa's corpse, which was then loaded into a van and dumped on the side of a trash-strewn road in a wooded area just outside of Washington Township, New Jersey, a 20-minute ride from South Philadelphia. Later that night, Nicky SCARFO hosted a mob feast at an Italian restaurant in South Philadelphia, where members of the gang toasted Testa's murder. SCARFO also introduced his gang to the 2 Mexican pistoleros, who had watched his back in El Paso, after he had Leonetti fly the 2 men up for the celebration. I hadn't seen my uncle that happy since we killed Vincent Falcone. The whole thing made me sick to my stomach. The following day, September 15th, 1984, authorities found the body of the fastest rising mobster in the United States, hog-tied and in a ditch off of Sicklerville Road in Camden County, about 50 yards from the Atlantic City Expressway. Testa's tennis whites, the clothes that he was wearing at the time of his execution, had been so badly stained by blood that they had turned a crimson red. It was a macabre scene and told you everything you needed to know about life in the SCARFO mob. Nobody was safe. As 1984 drew to a close, there was a lot more going on in and around the SCARFO mob besides the murder of Salvi Testa. Harry the Hunchback Ricobene, who was serving concurrent sentences on a federal racketeering conviction and a state charge on unlawful possession of a handgun, got dealt even worse news when he learned that 3 of his top aides, Joseph Padula, Victor DeLuca, and his own brother Mario Sonny Ricobene, had worked out deals with the feds and were set to testify against him in a new racketeering indictment that included the 1982 murder of SCARFO family consigliere Frank Monti. Harry the Hunchback was likely going to die in prison. 2 other SCARFO associates, Raymond Long John Martirano and Al Didone, met similar fates after both had been arrested and convicted of the December 1980 murder of Union boss John McCullough, with both receiving life sentences as a result, which would later be overturned. Like Ricobene, Martirano and Didone had been betrayed by one of their own. Willard Jr. Moran, the triggerman in the McCullough hit, pled guilty and cooperated in the prosecution of both men. Atlantic City Mayor Michael Matthews and former Local 54 official Frank Lentino were convicted in federal court in connection with their scheme to siphon money from the sale of the old city dump, known as the H-Tract, to a would-be casino developer who turned out to be an undercover FBI agent. Matthews was given the opportunity to cooperate against Philip Leonetti, who had also been indicted in the scheme, but the mayor told the FBI that, while he was afraid of Nicky SCARFO, he was petrified of his nephew Philip Leonetti. Without Matthews' testimony, the case against Leonetti fell apart, and the charges were dismissed. The disgraced former mayor was ultimately sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. The family's underboss, Salvatore Chucky Merlino, wound up pleading guilty to the bribery case out of Margate and was sentenced to 4 years in New Jersey State Prison. Merlino's lawyer promptly filed an appeal, and Merlino remained free on bail pending his appeal. Deciding that he'd had enough of Atlantic City and South Philadelphia for a while, SCARFO took a long vacation to South Florida during the winter of 1985 to relax and to clear his head a little bit. Philip Leonetti and Lawrence Merlino would join him on the excursion, much like they did following their acquittal for the Falcone murder in 1980. Me, my uncle, and Lawrence went down to Florida for almost 3 weeks. It was nice. We sat on the beach all day and ate at the best restaurants at night. We were staying at a condominium in Turnberry, which was a little ways from Miami. I loved these vacations. I needed them. We all did. While we were there, I said to my uncle, "We should get a place down here." My uncle loved the idea and told me and Lawrence to start looking at houses. We found a place in Fort Lauderdale that was owned by a guy from Philadelphia who was a real estate developer. It was a gorgeous, sprawling hacienda-style home right on the water. My uncle loved it. He had me pay the guy $650,000 in cash, and we bought the place. We named it Casablanca South, and we had a little sign made up that said that, and we put it on the front of the house. The place was gorgeous. It had a pool, a boat slip, the whole 9 yards. SCARFO's South Florida shopping spree wasn't done. We bought a white Rolls-Royce Silver Shadow that we drove whenever we were there. We brought our boat up from Atlantic City, which was a 40-footer, and we docked it right behind the house. We named the boat The Usual Suspects, and I was the captain of the boat. No one drove that boat except me. My uncle put a guy who was with us named Anthony Spike DiGregorio in the house, and he maintained it all year when we weren't there. He would cook Italian food, make homemade red wine, and tell stories all night. We would eat, drink, and laugh all night when Spike was around, even my uncle. He used to say to me, "Where the fuck did we find this guy?" sometimes as he was wiping tears out of his eyes from laughing so hard. Spike was a character, and one of the best guys you could ever meet, but he was also a degenerate gambler and a con man. He'd rob anything he could get his hands on, and he owed everybody and their mother money. One time a guy told me a story that he went to Spike's mother's house in South Philadelphia to see Spike, and he needed to borrow $5,000. He said Spike brought him in the house and listened to him and why he needed the money, and then said to the guy, "Do you see that woman in there?" And he pointed to his mother, who was in the kitchen cooking. "I love her more than anything on this planet, but guess what? If she asked me for $5,000, I wouldn't give it to her." The guy told me he was going back and forth, begging Spike for the money, because he knew Spike had just made a score. And within a few minutes, Spike had turned the whole thing around, and was now asking the guy if he could borrow money off of him. The guy said to Spike, "Spike, if I had money to loan you, I wouldn't be in your living room asking to borrow $5,000. And Spike said, "You have a point there." It was a never-ending comedy routine when Spike was around, and my uncle put him in charge of the house in Florida. When we were down in Florida, we were relaxing every day. The pool, the beach, the boat. We'd go out drinking, we'd go to dinner. Life was great when we were down there. Even my uncle was relaxed. It's almost like I forgot how bad things really were when I was down there. I guess I blocked it all out. Eventually, SCARFO's South Florida home became a retreat for the rest of his crime family members. Many of them had never ventured outside of Philadelphia, New Jersey, and New York. Their gracious host, who happened to be the most violent mob leader in the country, welcomed everyone to his lavish home and did his best to make it a family-friendly destination for the members of his gang. I would bring little Philip down. My uncle would have Chris, Nicky Jr., and his son Mark down there. Other guys would bring their sons or their nephews. I think my uncle was using Florida to bring everyone together, and keep everyone together and strengthen our family. With all of the killing and all of the treachery going on around us, there wasn't a whole lot of joking going on. But one time when we were down in Florida, it was me, my uncle, Nicky Jr., Spike, and a guy we were friendly with named Sam the Barber. Sam the Barber owned La Cucina, the restaurant on South Street in South Philadelphia that we used to go to. Now, Sam wasn't a made guy, but he was with us, and he was very close with Spike. My uncle had put Sam in charge of the renovations at the Florida house, and my uncle ended up spending close to $100,000, and Sam was overseeing all of it. When it was done, the place looked amazing, and my uncle was very happy. One night, after dinner, my uncle stands up and makes a speech thanking Sam for everything he did in getting the house ready, and he tells Sam he wants to give him something to show his appreciation. And he takes out a medal, like you would get in the army. Now, while he is talking to Sam and getting ready to give him the medal, Spike gets right in on the joke and starts saluting my uncle, like my uncle was a general. Even Sam's going for it, and he starts crying because he's so happy that he made my uncle proud. Me and Nicky Jr. were off to the side, and we were trying to keep our composure, but we were pissing ourselves. It was really funny. My uncle would only act like that down in Florida. That was the only place that he would ever slightly let his guard down, and that was usually because of Spike and all of his antics. As the winter hiatus came to an end, SCARFO, Leonetti, and the entire mob were back home in South Philadelphia and Atlantic City. It wasn't long before little Nicky had his sights on his next target. Shortly after becoming boss in 1981, Nicky SCARFO began having problems with an old-school South Philly mob associate named Frankie Flowers D'Alfonso. D'Alfonso had been closely aligned with former boss Angelo Bruno and had a lucrative working relationship with Bruno. The two men dabbled together in such ventures as bookmaking, loan sharking, real estate development, casino junkets, and even a closed-circuit television business. Bruno and D'Alfonso made a lot of money together, but Angelo Bruno was dead, and Nicky SCARFO, the new boss, felt that he was entitled to not only the money that D'Alfonso had been paying to Bruno, but an even larger share. When D'Alfonso balked, SCARFO ordered him beaten within an inch of his life, and had called on Salvi Testa and Testa's sidekick, Gino Milano, to carry out the beating. But there was a problem. Salvi came back and told my uncle that every time him and Gino thought they had Flowers, he was always with the Geeter, and they didn't want to do the beating in front of him. The Geeter with the heater was a popular Philadelphia-area disc jockey named Jerry Blavat, who was primarily known for spinning oldies records on his radio show, for his nightclub, Memories, in Margate, and for the record hops he held at catering halls and nightclubs in South Jersey and Philadelphia. When Ange was boss, the Geeter was around him a lot. He'd be at parties or gatherings we would attend, and we got to know who he was. When Ange died, the Geeter was hanging around Frankie Flowers, who had been real close with Ange. So around this time, Salvi and Gino were trying to give Frankie Flowers the beating my uncle ordered, but the Geeter was always hanging around Flowers and getting in the way of what we were trying to do. A week later, Testa and Milano finally caught him alone, and, armed with a baseball bat and steel pipe, ambushed D'Alfonso on a South Philadelphia street corner, beating him so badly that Frankie Flowers would spend the next several months in the hospital. D'Alfonso got the message. He started paying SCARFO's street tax, and for a while SCARFO seemed content with their arrangement. But as time elapsed, D'Alfonso began to pay less and less, and then stopped paying altogether. Little Nicky decided it was time to send D'Alfonso another message, only this time, instead of bats and pipes, the messengers would be carrying guns and orders to kill. In the summer of 1985, my uncle decides that he had had enough of Frankie Flowers and wants to kill him. But Flowers did business with Benny Eggs in New York, who was the Chin's underboss, and my uncle goes through the proper channels and reaches out to Benny Eggs and the Chin through Bobby Manna, who was the consigliere. My uncle sent word that he wants to kill Flowers, and the message we got back from New York was, "Do what you gotta do." So we banged him out as he was walking down the street near the Italian market in South Philly. They hit him 5 times, and he died right there in the street. My uncle loved it. He said, "Every once in a while you gotta show people this," and he made the sign of the gun. It keeps him in line. The July 1985 murder of Frankie Flowers served as a reminder to everyone that failure to pay the SCARFO street tax would result in death. In the weeks that followed the D'Alfonso murder, The cash was pouring in faster than it ever had before. The SCARFO mob was making money hand over fist. You have to remember, all the shake money, the money we got from the street tax, went into what we called the elbow, and it was divided between my uncle, he would take half, and me, Chucky, Lawrence, Salvi, and Ciancarlini would split the other half. But Salvi was dead, and Ciancarlini was in jail, so the elbow was now just the four of us. The new arrangement should have made Leonetti and the Merlino brothers extremely wealthy, but the despotic SCARFO began to exhibit a new trait, unbridled greed. One day my uncle tells me to go to Longport to see Felix Bocchino, who was an old-timer who used to be around Tony Bananas before he got killed. Everyone called him Little Felix. So I meet up with him at a coffee shop, and he gives me a shopping bag with $180,000 in cash inside. He made a score, and this was my uncle's end and the money for the elbow. I take the bag back to Georgia Avenue, and I bring it to my uncle in his apartment, and he says, "Don't tell Chucky or Lawrence about this. Let's keep this between us, and for the time being, I'm going to hold on to your end." Now, what am I going to do? Argue with him? By this time, my uncle was a multimillionaire. He stashed cash all over the place. We built a fake wall in his apartment, and we had a safe behind the wall. And we were hiding it in his furniture. We'd cut a hole in a couch or a chair, put $100,000 in there, and sew it back up. So the last thing he needed was to rob my end, or what was supposed to go to Chucky and Lawrence. But he did. He kept all that money for himself. A year after the death of its street boss, Salvi Testa, the SCARFO mob was still trying to reorganize to fill the void that came with losing someone of Testa's caliber. When Salvi died, a lot of things changed. For starters, he was one of our top guys, and you can't replace a guy like that with a guy like Tommy Dell, who was now one of the guys running the day-to-day operations in South Philadelphia, which is what Salvi did when he was alive. My uncle also broke up Salvi's crew, which is one of the other reasons he wanted to kill Salvi. He didn't like all them young guys together. Me and Lawrence were the only capos on the street at the time, but we were both based in Atlantic City. But as time went by, Lawrence was around less and less, and was doing more with his rebar company, Nat, and was starting to really build the business and make good money. This bothered my uncle when Lawrence wasn't around as much, and he would say, "Where's Lawrence been?" And I would tell him that Nat just got a new job or something, and my uncle would make a comment like, "So, now he don't want to hang around us? He's too good for us? He wants to go legit?" The truth is, I think Lawrence had gotten sick of being around my uncle and La Cosa Nostra, and he was trying to do his own thing, trying to break away a little bit. At that time, Chucky was still the underboss, but he had that 4-year jail sentence hanging over his head, and he started drinking very heavily around this time. Chucky always drank ever since I can remember, but now in the fall of 1985 he was drunk all the time. And not just drunk, I mean fall-down drunk. One night my uncle and I went to dinner at Angeloni's, and he asked me what my thoughts were regarding Chucky and Lawrence. I'm sitting there thinking, here we go again. Now this sick fuck wants to kill the two guys we were closest to, Chucky and Lawrence. I mean, Christ almighty, we just killed Salvi, so why not? Let's kill everybody. Who gives a fuck? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This guy had lost his fucking mind. This was not the La Cosa Nostra that I had swore an oath to, had killed for, and had dedicated my life to. So I looked my uncle square in the eye, and I said, "Uncle Nick, Chucky and Lawrence have been with us since the beginning. They have always been loyal. We've got nothing to worry about with either one of them. They are both solid." When I'm saying this to him, he could tell by looking into my eyes, and the way I was talking, how serious I was. I think my uncle was surprised that I voiced my opinion like that, but to be honest, I had to. Enough was enough. I couldn't take another killing like Salvi's. As close as we had been to Salvi, we were even closer with Chucky and Lawrence. Don't forget, my uncle had wanted me to kill the Blade, too. These were our top guys who had been with us since the beginning. Me and Lawrence were together almost every day, and my uncle and Chucky had been like brothers for almost 40 years. My uncle and the Blade went back even further. Right away, my uncle backed off of it and said, "Let's keep an eye on them and make sure they are not up to something." But I could tell he was steamed that I wasn't yesing him like I always did. At that very moment, I made a promise to myself that if my uncle brought this up again and started to move forward with any plans to kill Chucky or Lawrence, not only was I going to step in and stop it like I wish I had done with Salvi, and I had done with the Blade, but I was going to do something that me or someone else should have done a long time ago. I was going to kill my uncle. As 1985 came to a close, there was yet another mob hit that made national news. Only this time, it had nothing to do with Nicky Scarfo, Philip Leonetti, or the Philadelphia Atlantic City mob. On December 16th, Big Paul Castellano, the boss of New York's Gambino crime family, was gunned down outside of the now infamous Sparks Steakhouse as he arrived for a prearranged meeting with several underlings. Castellano's underboss, Tommy Bellotti, was also gunned down. The bodies of both men, two of the nation's most powerful gangsters, were on the street, riddled with bullets and covered in blood, much to the horror of the throngs of Christmas shoppers who had also lined the same Midtown Manhattan street. Castellano, who had been close to former Philadelphia Atlantic City mob boss Angelo Bruno, was gunned down in a palace coup orchestrated by an ambitious underling named John Gotti and one of his top lieutenants, a man that Leonetti knew well, Salvatore "Sammy the Bull" Gravano. My uncle and I had dealt with Castellano a couple of times, and he helped us with the murder of Johnny Keys by authorizing Sammy to do it, but that's about it. My uncle used to say that Castellano reminded him of Ange, meaning that he was more of a businessman and less of a gangster. That's the same thing that Sammy used to say about Castellano. He'd say, "This guy ain't a street guy like us, like your uncle. This guy thinks we're fucking IBM and not the Gambino crime family." Around this time, I was hearing a lot about John Gotti, most of it coming directly from Sammy. John and Sammy had become very close, and Sammy would say to me, "John's like us, Philip. He's a gangster's gangster. You and your uncle are going to like this guy." Me and Sammy had become very close, and we would go out drinking together or go out to dinner when he would come down to Atlantic City. I helped him when he got assigned the contract on this guy Frankie Stilitano, who everybody called Frankie Steele in 1981, after Frankie killed Nick Russo's son in Trenton. My uncle and Nick Russo had always been close. They were in Yardville together. We used to call him the Reverend. Nick Russo ran the Gambino family's operations in Trenton. Our family also had a presence in Trenton, and everything was always smooth between the two families because Nick was an absolute gentleman. Now, Frankie Stilitano was a cowboy, a renegade, and he had some problems with Nick Russo, and ultimately Nick Russo's son. One night, after they had an altercation, Stilitano opened up on them as they left a bar in Trenton, and he shot Nick Russo and killed his son. The Gambinos were looking to kill Stilitano, but no one could find him. He went into hiding. Sammy came down and saw me and my uncle, and he asked us for our help in trying to find him. This was after Sammy and his crew had done the Johnny Keys hit while we were on trial. Scarfo and Leonetti knew that Frankie Stilitano had connections to a loose-knit group of Irish gangsters that worked out of northeast Philadelphia. We found him and shot him in the head and left his body in the trunk of a car at the Philadelphia airport. Sammy came right down to thank us for whacking this guy out. That's the kind of guy he was. He was very big on respect. Now, a few days after Castellano gets killed, Sammy comes down, and he tells me and my uncle that everything is okay in New York, and that after New Year's he wants us to come up to Staten Island to meet his new boss, which we knew was John Gotti, but Sammy didn't tell us who it was. I had heard from Blackie Napoli that Sammy was going to be part of the new Gambino administration, either underboss or consigliere. As the NYPD and the FBI investigated the murders of Castellano and Bellotti in New York, Nicky SCARFO was busy throwing his annual Christmas party in South Philadelphia. Everybody was there, and everybody brings an envelope. That's how it was. The party was great, but Chucky was fall-down drunk. I'd never seen him that bad, and my uncle was furious. I mean, Chucky was the underboss, and the underboss can't behave like that. It makes the family look bad. And with my uncle, it was always about appearances and his reputation. After the party, when we were driving back to Atlantic City, I could tell that my uncle was steaming about Chucky, but we were in the car, so he is not going to say anything. The next day, we go for lunch at the Brajole Cafe, and he says, "I can't take any more of this guy's drunkenness. It's an embarrassment to me, and it makes us look weak." Now, I had already voiced my opinion about a month or so prior, so my uncle knew where I stood in regards to killing either Chucky or Lawrence. And regardless, Chucky was going to jail in a couple of weeks. He had to do the 4 years on the bribery case. I said, maybe we should have a sit-down with them. But Chucky and Lawrence are solid, and they always have been. And I'm looking him dead in his eye as I'm saying this, just like I did that night at Angeloni's. I wanted him to know that I was absolutely against killing either one of them, and that my position had not changed, and it wasn't going to change. We finished our lunch and didn't discuss it any further. Now, you have to understand that I had to be very careful with my uncle, because if he thought for a second that I wasn't 100% with him, or that I was going against him, he would have had me killed in a heartbeat. The fact that I was his nephew and his own blood meant absolutely nothing to him if he thought I was challenging him as boss, which I was by not backing him up on his plans to take out Chucky and Lawrence. A few days after Christmas, SCARFO, Leonetti, and the entire Philadelphia Atlantic City mob, including the Merlino brothers, headed down to Casablanca South for another winter retreat in Florida. As the SCARFO mob enjoyed their 2-week holiday of fun in the sun, little Nicky was growing increasingly frustrated with his underboss and his out-of-control binge drinking. When we were down there, Chucky's drinking got even worse. He was drunk the whole time we were there. I could tell my uncle had had it with both him and Lawrence, and was now starting to get angry with me because of the position I had taken. Everything was fucked up at this point. Nothing was right. Everything seemed off. Philip Leonetti knew that changes were coming. He just didn't know what they would be, or who may be dying as a result. A few days after we got back to Atlantic City, my uncle set up a meeting with Bobby Manna in North Jersey, and I drove him up. Every time we met with Bobby Manna, it was something serious. So, we are sitting there, and I have no idea what this was about. It was just me, my uncle, and Bobby. And my uncle says, "Bobby, I'm thinking of taking Chucky down and putting my nephew up. What are your thoughts? Do you think he's old enough?" What my uncle was saying is that he wanted to demote Chucky from underboss back down to soldier, and he wanted to elevate me from captain to underboss. I think he wanted Bobby's opinion because I was so young. I was only 32 years old. Bobby said, "Nick, if you feel he knows the rules and he knows how this thing works, then I don't think how old he is really matters much. Plus, don't forget, Luciano, Lansky, and Capone were all in their 20s when they started this thing, so I don't think age really matters." And my uncle just nodded and looked at me and patted me on the back of the head. A week later, Nicodemo SCARFO called a meeting and announced to the members of his crime family that Salvatore Chucky Merlino and his brother Lawrence Merlino were being taken down, and that his nephew, Philip Leonetti, was now the new underboss of the Philadelphia Atlantic City mob. Neither of the Merlinos was invited to the meeting. My uncle addressed the family and said, "I'm going to give Chucky a break here. I've known him a long time. I know that he is going to jail in a few weeks. I'm going to let him go to jail and clean his act up, sober up. If he does that, we will welcome him back into this family when he comes home. If he does not, it's this." And he did the sign of the gun. For him, his brother, and maybe his son. At 32 years old, Philip Leonetti became the youngest underboss in the modern-day history of La Cosa Nostra. He was the number 2 man behind his uncle, Nicodemo Little Nicky Scarfo, one of the most powerful mafia dons in the United States, and he couldn't have been less happy about it. I was numb. I didn't have a feeling one way or the other. By this time I was so sick of my uncle and all of his treachery that I didn't even want to be around him anymore, let alone be involved in La Cosa Nostra. That's how bad it had become. Following the murder of Salvi Testa and his uncle's betrayal of Nick the Blade Virgilio and the Merlino brothers, Philip Leonetti had seen enough to believe that eventually his uncle would turn on him. If we had made it a few more years, he would have turned on me and tried to have me killed. I have no doubt in my mind about it. One time my uncle and Nicky Jr. got into an argument, and Nicky Jr. was talking fresh to my uncle. I was right there, but I didn't say a word. When Nicky Jr. left, my uncle turned to me and started hollering, "You need to teach him that he can't talk to me like that." And I still didn't say anything. Very quickly my uncle's colors change and he says to me, like he just figured out the answer to his own question, "I see what it is. You want him to get in trouble. You want me and him to be at odds. I see what it is with you." This is how sick he was. In his mind, he thought I wanted him and Nicky Jr. to argue and to fight because it would be better for me, which was the last thing on my mind. As Leonetti began to settle into his new position as underboss, Scarfo placed a relatively inexperienced duo of Francis Faffi Iannarella and Tommy Del Giorno in charge of the family's street operation in Philadelphia, and entrusted them with delivering the news to the Merlino brothers that they had been taken down. My uncle said to me in a very aggressive tone, "If I have to see either one of them guys, meaning Chucky or Lawrence, if either one of them try and come down here and see me, I am ordering you to kill them on the spot. And that is a direct order from me to you. I'm not your uncle saying this, I'm your boss in La Cosa Nostra. If you don't want to see them dead, tell them to stay the fuck in Philadelphia and clean their acts up." It was as if my uncle was saying that he spared their lives because I had spoken against it, but he was warning me that they were on very thin ice. The very next day I get a call in the office from Chucky. He says, "Philip, what's going on? He took us down and now he won't see me." I told him, I said, "Chuck, just stay in Philadelphia. Be with your family, go do your sentence, and everything will be okay." And he said, "What did I do? I didn't do anything. I just want to come down and talk to him and straighten things out before I go to jail." And I said, "Chuck, please don't come here. Please don't. Be with your family, go to jail, and everything is going to be okay. But please do not come here, Chuck. I'm begging you." Salvatore Chucky Merlino had been around Nicky Scarfo for over 30 years, and he knew by the tone of Philip Leonetti's voice in imploring him not to come to Atlantic City that Leonetti was warning him of Scarfo's desire to kill him if he did. Merlino spent the next few weeks in South Philadelphia, and then turned himself in a few weeks later, on February 21, 1986, to begin serving his 4-year prison sentence. His brother Lawrence apparently got the memo too, and avoided Scarfo, Leonetti, and Georgia Avenue at all costs. I didn't save Chucky and Lawrence's life with that call. I saved my uncle's, because there was no way I was killing either one of them, and if push came to shove, I was going to kill my uncle. I was absolutely disgusted with him, because at that point, if I had disobeyed his direct order to me to kill either one of them, he would have had me killed, and then he would have killed them. That's how bad things were at this time. We weren't a family anymore. The Scarfo mob, which had thrived with Chucky Merlino as underboss and Salvi Testa as street boss, was no longer. Testa had been murdered on Scarfo's orders, and Chucky Merlino was behind bars and stripped of his rank. Nicholas, Nick the Crow Caramandi, was a soldier in the Scarfo mob, a made man following his participation in the 1983 murder of Pat Spirito. The Crow was a con artist, a flim-flammer. He wasn't a gangster, but he always had some scheme going, and once in a while whatever he was doing would hit pretty big, and we would make a lot of money, so my uncle kind of tolerated him. He started to get involved in Philadelphia, shaking down construction companies, so they could get their projects done without any interference. You have to understand that all the unions were under our control, and we could shut projects down with a phone call, so these guys would pay us so that we wouldn't bother them. Around this time, Caramandi became acquainted with a Philadelphia city councilman from South Philadelphia named Leland Beloff, and Beloff's aide, Robert Rigo. We knew Leland Beloff. He came every year to our Christmas party, and always paid his respects to my uncle if we saw him out somewhere. In turn, we would have the unions support him during his elections, and he would do little favors for us from time to time. So as the Crow starts getting more involved with the construction stuff, he comes into contact with Beloff, who as councilman had a lot of influence over what projects would go forward and what projects would not. So one day the Crow comes down to see my uncle, and he asks for permission to start doing business deals with Beloff, and my uncle gives him the okay, but says, "Be careful, use your head." In April 1986, Nicodemo Scarfo and Philip Leonetti were the boss and underboss of the Philadelphia Atlantic City mob. Scarfo was 57 years old, and Leonetti was just 33. As they tried to reshuffle their own family hierarchy following numerous deaths, demotions, and incarcerations, the New York families were going through the same type of bloodletting that Philadelphia had gone through in the early 1980s, following the deaths of Angelo Bruno and Philip Testa. After Paul Castellano got killed in New York, John Gotti became the boss of the Gambino family, and he made Frankie DeCicco his underboss, and he named Sammy the Bull his number 3, his consigliere. This was their new administration. Even though our family was aligned with the Genovese, with the Chin, and Bobby Manna, we always had a working relationship with the Gambinos, the Lucchese's, the Colombos, and the Bonanos, who were the other families in New York. But what happened was the Chin had a strong relationship with Paul Castellano, in the sense that while they weren't the best of friends, they didn't get in each other's way, and they would help one another from time to time. When Gotti killed Castellano, the Chin decided to kill Gotti in retaliation, and made a pact with the Lucchese's and their boss, Vic Amuso, that they were going to kill Gotti and put another guy in there to run the Gambinos so that they would be able to control the family, using the new boss as their puppet. This would avenge Paul Castellano's death and make the Chin even stronger, because he would essentially control both the Genovese and Gambino families and have absolute control over the commission, and it would have made Vic Amuso and the Lucchese's the second most powerful family in New York behind Chin's. The Chin hated John Gotti and wanted to eliminate him at all costs. On April 13, 1986, a low-level Genovese associate walked toward a parked car outside of the Veteran and Friends Social Club in the Dyker Heights section of Brooklyn. Very casually, he placed a bag containing a powerful homemade bomb underneath the car. Inside the club, new Gambino boss John Gotti, his underboss Frankie DeCicco, and his consigliere Salvatore Sammy the Bull Gravano were scheduled to attend a meeting, and when the meeting was done, the men were supposed to drive back to Gotti's headquarters, the Ravenite Social Club in the Little Italy section of Lower Manhattan. Gotti's would-be bomber sat in a parked car just up the street with a full view of the Veteran and Friends Social Club and the car with the bag of explosives under it that belonged to Frankie DeCicco. The hit planned for Gotti and DeCicco was eerily similar to the bombing death of Philip Testa in March 1981. As DeCicco and another man believed to be Gotti approached the car, the bomb was detonated, killing DeCicco instantly and wounding the other man, who turned out not to be John Gotti. The Chin's plan had failed, and now Gotti and the Gambinos were on high alert. My uncle and I had been told by Bobby Manna that John Gotti did in fact get the commission's permission to kill Paul Castellano, but I didn't believe it, and it never made any sense to me. I think Bobby told us that because the Chin never wanted to be connected to the killing of Frankie DeCicco and the attempted killing of John Gotti, by telling us that Gotti had gotten the okay, it took suspicion away from the Chin being involved in the bombing. They used the bomb to make it look like the Siggies did it because they were close to Castellano. The use of explosive devices was against the rules of La Cosa Nostra. I remember thinking to myself, This fucking Chin ain't so crazy. He's the shrewdest of them all, and the most deadly. Another person who told both Scarfo and Leonetti that John Gotti had gotten permission from the commission to murder Paul Castellano was Gotti himself. A month or so after Frankie DeCicco got killed, my uncle and I went up to a house on Staten Island belonging to Sammy the Bull's brother-in-law, and Sammy the Bull formally introduced us to John Gotti as the boss of the Gambino family. After DeCicco got killed, Sammy became the underboss. Gotti said to my uncle, "Nick, I wanted you to know that I got the okay, and I did this thing right." And my uncle said, "I'm sure you did, John." For the next several hours, the bosses and underbosses of the Gambino crime family and the Bruno Scarfo crime family got acquainted with one another over drinks and a homemade Italian feast. It was just the four of us. Gotti and my uncle talked about how similar Ange and Castellano were, in the sense that they were racketeers and not gangsters, which is exactly what me and Sammy had said all along. After a while, Gotti said to me, "My friend Sammy here has told me a lot about you." And then he said to my uncle, "Your nephew here has quite a reputation for such a young man." My uncle said, "He's been with me since he was a boy, and he knows this thing as well as I do." Gotti said, "You did good with him. You should be proud to call him your nephew, an underboss. We need more young men like him in La Cosa Nostra. But these young kids today, this generation, they're not like us, Nick. There's no one left to teach them the rules and show them the parameters of what this thing is all about." Gotti spoke very fondly of his mentor, Agnello della Croce, and my uncle talked the same way about Skinny Razor, and you could tell that Gotti felt the same way about La Cosa Nostra that my uncle did. All in all, it was a great meeting. When we got back to Atlantic City, my uncle said of Gotti, "He's sharp. I now know why our friend," and he stroked his chin, meaning Gigante, "doesn't like him.